Hello there. Welcome back to our podcast. In this episode, we have a closer look to what actually happened to Atlantis. Plato told a story about a perfect civilization that vanished in a single day. For over 2,000 years, explorers have died searching for its ruins. The strange part isn't that Atlantis disappeared. It's that everyone agrees it existed somewhere, just never where anyone has looked. Here's what the evidence actually says. The legend begins in ancient Athens, around 360 BC. Plato, the philosopher who shaped Western thought, wrote two dialogues that casually mentioned an advanced island empire. He described it through the voice of Critias, who claimed the story came from Solon, who heard it from Egyptian priests. Already we're playing telephone across generations and cultures. But Plato's description was disturbingly specific. Atlantis sat beyond the Pillars of Hercules, what we now call the Strait of Gibraltar. The island was larger than Libya and Asia combined, whatever that meant in ancient geography. Its people had built a sophisticated civilization with massive temples, intricate canal systems, and military power that threatened the known world. According to Plato, they grew arrogant. The gods noticed, and in a single catastrophic day and night, earthquakes and floods dragged the entire island beneath the waves. That's the story, a morality tale about hubris wrapped in geographic details. Most scholars read it and shrug. Obviously, Plato invented Atlantis to make a philosophical point about the corruption of ideal societies. Case closed. Except the details won't let go. Plato describes concentric rings of water and land, specific measurements for walls and bridges, the types of stones they quarried. He mentions hot and cold springs, a plain that measured 3,000 by 2,000 stadia, a mountain range shielding the city from northern winds. This isn't vague myth-making. It reads like someone describing a place they've actually seen. For centuries, nobody cared. Plato's students dismissed Atlantis as allegory. Aristotle, his most famous pupil, supposedly said his teacher created and destroyed Atlantis in the same breath. The ancient world moved on. Rome rose and fell without bothering to search for sunken islands. Then, something changed. The age of exploration cracked the world open. Suddenly, Europeans were discovering actual unknown civilizations, cities in jungles, empires across oceans that their maps insisted couldn't exist. If the Americas were real, why not Atlantis? The floodgates opened. Every explorer with a ship and a hunch became an Atlantis hunter. Christopher Columbus himself believed he was sailing toward Atlantean territories. Francis Bacon wrote about a new Atlantis in the Americas. Ignatius Donnelly, an American congressman, published a book in 1882 arguing that Atlantis was the common ancestor of all ancient civilizations, the missing link explaining why Egyptians and Mayans built pyramids. His evidence was creative. His conclusions were nonsense, but his timing was perfect. The Victorian era was obsessed with lost civilizations. Archaeologists were uncovering Troy, Pompeii, entire cities that history had forgotten. If Troy was real despite being dismissed as myth, maybe Atlantis deserved a second look. Donnelly's book sold like mad. Atlantis transformed from philosophical footnote to global obsession practically overnight. Then the theories exploded in every direction. Some placed Atlantis in the Mediterranean. Others insisted it was Antarctica before ice covered the continent. Mystics claimed it was in the Atlantic, obviously, destroyed when the Earth's crust shifted. Edgar Cayce, the famous psychic, described elaborate visions of Atlantean crystal technology and predicted its ruins would rise near Bimini in 1968. When formations appeared off Bimini's coast that year, believers lost their minds. Geologists patiently explained they were natural beach rock formations. Nobody listened. The search spread like fever. Indonesia, Bolivia, Ireland, Morocco, the North Sea, the Black Sea, the Azores, Sardinia, Cyprus, Malta, Crete. Every coastline with ancient ruins became a candidate. Every underwater formation photographed by sonar sparked new expeditions. Atlantis was everywhere and nowhere, shape-shifting to fit whatever evidence someone wanted to highlight. But here's what nobody talks about. The obsession with finding Atlantis's physical location misses the more interesting question. Why did Plato describe it in the first place? Plato wasn't a historian. He was a philosopher who used stories to explore ideas. His dialogues are full of myths and allegories. The cave, the ring of Gyges, the myth of Nobody searches for the physical cave where shadows fooled prisoners. We understand those are thought experiments. So why does Atlantis get different treatment? The answer sits in those uncomfortable details. Plato's other myths are clearly symbolic, abstract, designed to illustrate concepts. Atlantis is different. He gives dates, 9,000 years before Solon's time. He describes political structures, military campaigns, agricultural output. He even apologizes at one point for the story's length, promising to return to philosophy after finishing the historical account. It doesn't read like allegory. It reads like someone struggling to explain something real that doesn't quite fit their understanding. Consider the context. Plato lived in a world where catastrophic change was normal. Cities were destroyed by earthquakes constantly. Volcanic eruptions buried entire populations. The Mediterranean was a violent place where civilizations appeared and vanished with terrifying regularity. From Plato's perspective, an advanced society disappearing overnight wasn't fantasy. It was Tuesday. Now look at what was actually happening in the Mediterranean during Plato's lifetime. About 1,000 years before he wrote, something extraordinary occurred in the Aegean Sea. The volcanic island of Thera, now called Santorini, exploded with a force that makes modern eruptions look like firecrackers. The blast was 4 times more powerful than Krakatoa. It generated tsunamis over 100 feet high that slammed into coastlines across the Mediterranean. Thera sat at the center of the Minoan civilization, one of the most advanced cultures of the Bronze Age. The Minoans had multi-story palaces with running water and sophisticated art. They dominated Mediterranean trade. Their influence reached Egypt, the Levant, mainland Greece. They were, by any measure, a superpower. Then Thera erupted. The explosion was so massive it collapsed the island's center, creating a caldera that filled with seawater. The tsunamis devastated coastal settlements. Ash fell across the region, choking agriculture. And the Minoan civilization, which had flourished for centuries, began a rapid decline. Within a generation or two, it had collapsed completely. This happened 900 years before Plato. But memories last. Stories persist. Egypt had written records of catastrophic events in the Mediterranean. Greek oral traditions preserved garbled accounts of great disasters. Plato had access to all of it, filtered through time and translation and human error. So maybe Atlantis isn't a single place. Maybe it's an echo, a distorted memory of real events compressed and transformed through centuries of retelling. The Minoans provided the advanced civilization. Thera provided the catastrophic destruction. Egyptian records provided the time-scale confusion. 900 years becoming 9,000 through scribal error or mistranslation. Plato stitched together fragments of true history and created something that felt real because parts of it were. This theory has problems. Thera is inside the Mediterranean, not beyond the Pillars of Hercules. The timeline is wrong. The geography doesn't match. But memories are flexible. Details shift. A story told and retold across centuries doesn't preserve facts. It preserves impressions, the emotional truth of catastrophe, the warning that great civilizations can vanish. Yet Thera isn't the only candidate. Because the Mediterranean wasn't the only place where Bronze Age civilizations collapsed. Around 1200 BC, roughly 2 centuries after Thera erupted, something even stranger happened. A wave of destruction swept across the entire eastern Mediterranean. The Hittite Empire fell. Mycenaean Greece collapsed. Ugarit burned. Cities across the Levant were abandoned. Even Egypt barely survived, fighting off mysterious invaders they called the Sea Peoples. This collapse is one of history's great mysteries. We don't know who the Sea Peoples were. We don't know exactly what triggered the cascade of failures. Theories range from climate change to technological disruption to mass migration. But the result was undeniable. The interconnected civilization system that had flourished for centuries shattered. The Bronze Age ended. A dark age began. Could Atlantis be a memory of this broader collapse? Not a single island, but the entire lost world of Bronze Age Mediterranean civilization. Plato, writing centuries later, might have compressed multiple disasters into one dramatic story. The Sea Peoples became Atlantean invaders. The Bronze Age collapse became divine punishment. The gradual decline of multiple civilizations became a single catastrophic day. This reading makes Atlantis something stranger and sadder than a sunken city. It makes it a cultural ghost, the Mediterranean's collective memory of a time when everything fell apart. But there's another angle nobody expects. What if Plato was describing something that hadn't happened yet? Philosophers don't just look backward, they look at patterns. Plato watched Athens rise to greatness, become arrogant with power, and nearly destroy itself in the Peloponnesian War. He saw democracy corrupt into mob rule. He watched his teacher Socrates executed by the state. Plato lived through Athens' decline from golden age to shadow of former glory. He knew firsthand how quickly great civilizations could fall. So when he described Atlantis, maybe he wasn't encoding ancient history. Maybe he was warning about the future, his own city-state, his own civilization, heading toward the same fate. The story wasn't about finding a lost island. It was about recognizing the pattern before it repeated. This interpretation makes Atlantis less archaeology and more prophecy. Not a place to discover, but a fate to avoid. Which explains why the story has lasted. Every civilization that reads Plato sees itself. Every empire at its height wonders if it's approaching its catastrophic day. Atlantis becomes a mirror, reflecting our fears that everything we've built might be more fragile than we want to believe. And yet people keep searching. Because humans need mysteries to be solvable. We need lost things to be found. The idea that Atlantis might be metaphor or cultural memory or philosophical warning isn't satisfying enough. We want the ruins. We want proof. We want to stand where the Atlanteans stood and understand what they knew. So the expeditions continue. New technologies enable new searches. Satellite imaging reveals underwater formations. Ground-penetrating radar finds anomalies beneath ancient sites. Every few years, someone announces they've found Atlantis. The media reports it breathlessly. Archaeologists sigh and explain again why it's not what they think. The cycle repeats. The fascinating part is what these searches reveal even when they fail. We've mapped vast stretches of ocean floor. We've discovered real sunken cities, ancient harbors, and settlements claimed by rising seas. We've found evidence of catastrophic floods, asteroid impacts, volcanic eruptions that reshaped coastlines. The Mediterranean alone holds dozens of drowned sites that would qualify as legendary if only Plato had written about them. We've learned that Bronze Age civilizations were far more sophisticated than we imagined. They had extensive trade networks, advanced astronomy, complex mathematics, architectural achievements that still impress. The ancient world was stranger and more capable than Victorian scholars believed possible. In searching for Atlantis, we've discovered that the real past is almost as remarkable as the legend. Which brings us back to the original question. What actually happened to Atlantis? The answer depends on what Atlantis actually was. If it's a specific historical place, then it's probably a distorted memory of Thera and the Minoans, mixed with other Bronze Age disasters and filtered through centuries of retelling. If it's a philosophical construct, then it happened every time a civilization collapsed from hubris, and it hasn't stopped happening. But there's a third possibility that nobody likes to consider. What if Plato was simply telling the truth as he understood it? Not inventing, not encoding, not warning. Just passing along a story he genuinely believed was historical. The Egyptian priest told Solon about a disaster 9,000 years ago. Solon told Critias's grandfather. The grandfather told Critias. Critias told Plato. And Plato wrote it down, adding his own philosophical spin, but preserving what he thought was real history. If that's true, then Atlantis becomes something different entirely. Not a Mediterranean civilization, not a Bronze Age memory, but something older, stranger, from a time before written history, when the world looked completely different. 9,000 years before Plato takes us back to 9,400 BC, the end of the last ice age when sea levels were rising, coastlines were shifting, and entire landscapes were being swallowed by water. Humans lived through that. They watched their world drown as glaciers melted and oceans rose. Coastal settlements that had existed for generations vanished beneath the waves. The geography of Earth literally transformed, and those humans carried memories, stories passed down through oral tradition for thousands of years before anyone wrote them down. Could Atlantis be one of those stories? A genuine memory of a real place, lost when the Ice Age ended and the seas rose. Not an advanced technological civilization, but an impressive Stone Age culture that seemed miraculous to the people who remembered it. The details would change over millennia of retelling. The timeline would blur. The technology would be upgraded to match whatever era was doing the remembering. But the core memory would persist, a real place, really destroyed, really mourned. This version of Atlantis can't be found because it's been underwater for over 11,000 years. The ruins, if they exist, are buried under silt and sand in places we haven't thought to look because we didn't believe there was anything to find. But recent discoveries keep pushing back the timeline of human sophistication. Göbekli Tepe in Turkey, a massive temple complex built over 11,000 years ago, proved that Stone Age humans could create monumental architecture. Underwater ruins off the coast of India date back thousands of years before the first supposed civilizations. We keep finding evidence that humans were more advanced earlier than we thought possible. So maybe the search for Atlantis isn't futile. Maybe we just haven't been looking in the right time period. The flood myths support this theory more than people realize. Nearly every ancient culture has one. The biblical flood, the Epic of Gilgamesh, Greek, Hindu, Chinese, Aboriginal, Native American traditions, all describe a catastrophic deluge that destroyed an earlier world. For a long time, scholars dismissed these as purely mythological, universal human fears projected onto water. But what if they're cultural memories of the same real event? Between 15,000 and 7,000 years ago, sea levels rose over 400 feet as the Ice Age ended. That's not a gradual change you adapt to. That's cities vanishing, coastlines retreating miles inland, river valleys becoming bays, entire landscapes erased within a human lifetime. People living through that would absolutely tell stories about it. Stories that would be passed down as warnings, as history, as sacred truth. And here's what makes this relevant to Atlantis. If you're an advanced coastal civilization during that period, you're doomed. Everything you built, everything you achieved, gets swallowed by rising water. The survivors scatter inland, carrying stories of the great civilization that was lost. Over thousands of years, Those stories get embellished, mythologized, combined with other disasters. Details shift, but the emotional truth remains. There was something great. Water destroyed it. It's gone forever. Plato's Egyptian priests might have been passing along exactly this kind of deep memory. Egypt itself is ancient enough to have oral traditions stretching back into the Ice Age. Their civilization emerged from somewhere. Their knowledge came from predecessors. They didn't invent agriculture and architecture from nothing. They inherited techniques, stories, maybe even survivors from older cultures we haven't identified yet. This matters because it changes what we're looking for. If Atlantis is a Bronze Age civilization, we're searching the Mediterranean, looking for recognizable ruins, pottery, written records. But if it's an Ice Age culture, we need to look underwater, in places that were coastal 11,000 years ago, but are now submerged continental shelf. We need to look for megalithic structures, sophisticated stonework, evidence of organized society in a time period we've barely explored. The technology exists now. Sonar mapping, underwater archaeology, satellite imaging that can detect submerged structures. We've barely used it. Most underwater archaeology focuses on shipwrecks and known historical sites. Very few expeditions search for prehistorical civilizations because the academic consensus says they don't exist. But that consensus is cracking. Graham Hancock has spent decades arguing for advanced Ice Age civilizations. Mainstream archaeology has spent decades dismissing him. But with every new discovery, his timeline looks less crazy. Göbekli Tepe was impossible until it wasn't. The Sphinx water erosion theory was laughable until geologists started agreeing the evidence was there. The idea that humans built sophisticated structures before Sumer seems less absurd every year. None of this proves Atlantis existed, but it opens the door to the possibility that Plato's story isn't entirely fiction, that somewhere beneath the waves lies evidence of a culture we've forgotten. Not aliens, not magic crystals, just humans, being ingenious and ambitious, and ultimately vulnerable to forces beyond their control. The same story that's played out countless times since. The real question isn't whether Atlantis existed, it's whether we're brave enough to look for it in the right places. Because if it's real, it fundamentally changes our understanding of human history. It means civilization is older than we thought. It means our ancestors were more capable than we gave them credit for. It means the line between prehistory and history is blurrier than our textbooks admit. But there's resistance to this idea. Academic careers are built on established timelines. Rewriting prehistory threatens decades of scholarship. So evidence gets dismissed, alternative theories get ridiculed, and researchers who pursue unconventional ideas risk professional suicide. The system protects itself even when the system might be wrong. This is where Atlantis becomes more than just an archaeological mystery. It becomes a question about how we construct knowledge. Who decides what's possible? What evidence do we accept? How much proof do we need before we revise our understanding? These aren't just academic questions. They shape how we see ourselves as a species. If Atlantis is real, it means humans have risen and fallen before. It means we're not the first to think we've figured everything out. It means the cycle of civilization, growth, hubris, collapse, is older and more persistent than we imagined. That's unsettling. It suggests our current civilization isn't the pinnacle of human achievement. It's just the latest attempt. And like all the others, it's temporary. Plato understood this. Whether Atlantis was real or invented, his point was clear. Civilizations end. Power corrupts. Pride precedes destruction. The specifics don't matter as much as the pattern. We build, we succeed, we forget we're mortal, and then something reminds us. War, disease, environmental collapse. The mechanism varies, but the result is consistent. What we built falls. What we knew gets forgotten. And whoever comes after has to start over. The search for Atlantis, then, is really a search for proof of this cycle. We want evidence that it's happened before, that collapse isn't new, that survival and rebuilding are part of the human experience. Maybe that's comforting, or maybe it's terrifying. Depends on whether you think we're smart enough to break the pattern. Right now, we're living in an age that feels permanent. Technology, globalization, interconnected systems. It seems impossible that this could all just vanish. But that's what every civilization thinks right before it ends. The Romans thought their empire was eternal. The Mayans built cities they assumed would stand forever. The Bronze Age cultures believed their trade networks were unbreakable. Then climate shifted, or resources ran out, or political systems collapsed. And within a generation, everything changed. We're not special. We're not immune. The same forces that destroyed previous civilizations are still active. Climate change, resource depletion, political instability, pandemic disease. We have better technology, but we also have more ways to fail catastrophically. Nuclear weapons, biological warfare, artificial intelligence we don't fully control. The risks scale with the achievements. This is why Atlantis matters. Not because finding it would rewrite history books, though it would, but because it forces us to confront our own fragility. If a sophisticated civilization could vanish so completely that we're not even sure it existed, what makes us think ours won't? Our monuments, our achievements, our certainties, all of it could be underwater rubble that future archaeologists debate about. The difference is we have the capacity to learn from the pattern. We can study collapses. We can identify warning signs. We can potentially avoid the mistakes that doomed previous societies. But only if we accept that we're vulnerable. Only if we stop thinking we're too advanced to fail. Only if we take the lesson seriously. Plato was trying to teach that lesson. Whether Atlantis was real or not, the story serves the same purpose. It's a warning, a reminder, a cautionary tale about what happens when civilizations stop being humble. The Atlanteans, in his telling, became arrogant. They thought their power made them invincible. They attacked neighbors. They ignored the gods. And for that, they were destroyed in a single day and night. The timeline might be mythological. The details might be embellished. But the core truth resonates because we recognize it. We see nations make the same mistakes. We watch power corrupt. We observe societies prioritizing short-term gain over long-term survival. The specifics change, but the pattern persists. We never seem to learn. Maybe we can't. Maybe the cycle is inevitable. Humans build civilizations. Civilizations generate surplus. Surplus creates inequality. Inequality breeds conflict. And conflict eventually destroys what was built. Then survivors start over. The archaeological record supports this. Civilizations rise and fall with predictable regularity. The average lifespan of an empire is about 250 years. We're overdue. But maybe this time is different. We have global communication. We have historical records stretching back millennia. We have the scientific method. We have the ability to model complex systems and predict outcomes. We have, theoretically, the tools to break the cycle. Whether we have the wisdom to use them is another question. The search for Atlantis forces us to ask that question. If we find evidence of an advanced prehistoric civilization, destroyed by forces it couldn't control, what does that mean for us? Are we repeating their mistakes? Are we ignoring the same warnings? Are we building on the same fault lines, literal and metaphorical, that brought them down? Some researchers think Atlantis is a key to understanding climate catastrophe. If rising sea levels destroyed an Ice Age civilization, we're facing the same threat. Coastal cities today, New York, London, Shanghai, Mumbai, are as vulnerable as any ancient settlement. We're building higher and assuming we'll adapt. But adaptation has limits. If sea levels rise faster than we can respond, millions of people will be displaced. Infrastructure will be lost. Entire regions will become uninhabitable. That's not speculation. That's physics. Ice melts, water expands, coastlines change. We know this. We're watching it happen. And we're building luxury condos on beaches anyway because we can't imagine the world actually changing that dramatically. The Atlanteans probably couldn't imagine it either, until it happened. Other researchers focus on the political parallels. Atlantis, in Plato's account, was a powerful empire that overextended itself. It conquered surrounding territories, accumulated wealth, and grew arrogant. Then it picked a fight with Athens, a smaller but more virtuous state, and lost. The gods, displeased with Atlantean hubris, destroyed the entire civilization as punishment. Strip away the divine intervention, and you have a story about imperial overreach. Empires expand until they can't sustain themselves. They grow dependent on conquered resources. They alienate neighbors. They hollow out from within as inequality grows and social cohesion fractures. Eventually something breaks. A military defeat, an economic crisis, a subject population revolt the center cannot hold. We're watching this play out in real time. Global powers competing for resources. Military interventions that cost more than they gain. Economic systems that concentrate wealth while leaving populations unstable. The parallels aren't subtle. Whether Atlantis was real or invented, Plato was describing a pattern he recognized, and that pattern is still active. The question is whether recognition leads to prevention. Can we see the warning signs and change course? Or are we locked into the cycle by forces stronger than individual will, human nature, economic incentives, political inertia, the momentum of history? These aren't easy to overcome. They might be impossible. But the search continues. Expeditions scan ocean floors. Researchers analyze geological data. Archaeologists excavate sites that challenge conventional timelines. Slowly, carefully, the picture of human prehistory is being revised. We're discovering that our ancestors were more sophisticated than we thought, that civilization is older than we assumed, that the past holds secrets we're only beginning to uncover. Atlantis might be one of those secrets, or it might remain forever mythological. But either way, the search itself is valuable. It pushes us to question assumptions. It forces us to look at evidence with fresh eyes. It reminds us that history is not a settled fact, but an ongoing investigation. What we know is always incomplete. What we believe is always provisional. The story keeps evolving. And maybe that's the real lesson of Atlantis. Not that a specific civilization existed and fell, but that all civilizations exist and fall. That impermanence is the only constant. That what we build today will be ruins tomorrow, whether in decades or millennia. The timeline doesn't change the truth. Nothing lasts. Everything ends. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we give up? Decide nothing matters because it's all temporary? Or do we build anyway, knowing it won't last, because the act of building is what makes us human? Do we create, explore, achieve, love, struggle, not despite the certainty of ending, but because of it? That's the choice Atlantis presents, not as history, but as philosophy, not as a riddle to solve, but as a mirror to hold up, the civilization that reached too high and drowned for it, the empire that forgot humility and paid the price, the people who thought themselves invincible until the water came. Every generation needs this story. Every culture has a version. Atlantis just happens to be the one that stuck, the one that refuses to fade, the one that keeps pulling us back into its depths. And maybe that persistence itself is the evidence, not of a lost continent, but of a truth we keep trying to forget, that we are fragile, that our systems are temporary, that the ground beneath our feet is less solid than we pretend. Atlantis endures because it speaks to that fear, the primal terror of the floor dropping out, of everything familiar vanishing in an instant, of being utterly helpless against forces we cannot control. Modern civilization insulates us from that feeling. We have insurance, emergency services, disaster relief, infrastructure designed to withstand the predictable. We've engineered resilience into our systems, redundancy, backup plans, fail-safes. We've convinced ourselves we can manage risk, that catastrophe is something we can calculate and prepare for, that we've learned from history enough to avoid repeating it. Then a pandemic shuts down the global economy, or a financial crisis wipes out retirement accounts, or a hurricane levels a city, or wildfires consume neighborhoods. And suddenly, the insurance doesn't cover it. The emergency services are overwhelmed. The infrastructure fails. The backup plans collapse. And we remember, oh, we're not actually in control. We never were. Atlantis is the story we tell ourselves when we forget that, when we get too comfortable, when we start believing our own propaganda about human mastery over nature, when we think technology has finally given us the upper hand. The story reappears as a correction, a reminder, a warning whispered from the past. But warnings only work if you listen. And we're not great at listening. We're excellent at hearing, nodding, acknowledging, then continuing exactly as before. We know smoking causes cancer. We smoke. We know climate change is accelerating. We accelerate. We know inequality breeds instability. We concentrate wealth anyway. Knowledge doesn't automatically produce action. Understanding doesn't guarantee change. So Atlantis gets retold, generation after generation, culture after culture, always with the same core. A great civilization destroyed by its own hubris. The details shift. The location moves. The technology updates. But the skeleton remains. Pride comes before the fall. Excess invites disaster. What rises must eventually sink. The psychological appeal is obvious. It flatters us. We get to feel wise for recognizing the pattern, superior for learning the lesson, safe because we've identified the mistake. We're not like them. We're smarter, more aware, more humble. We would never make those errors. We would see the warning signs. We would change course in time. We would survive. Except we wouldn't. We're making the same choices right now. Building in flood zones, depleting resources, ignoring long-term consequences. The only difference is we have better special effects, faster communication, more sophisticated justifications. The underlying behavior is identical. We're just more efficient about it. That's the uncomfortable part of the Atlantis story. Not that a civilization fell, but that civilizations keep falling, that the pattern repeats, that we never actually learn. We remember, we study, we analyze, we extract lessons, then we proceed to ignore every single one of them, because short-term incentives always override long-term wisdom, because individual rationality produces collective irrationality, because knowing what to do and doing it are completely different things. The search for Atlantis, then, becomes a search for proof that we're different, that this time it's different, that we've finally evolved past the self-destructive patterns of our ancestors. If we can find the ruins, study them, understand exactly what went wrong, maybe we can avoid the same fate. Maybe knowledge really will lead to prevention this time. Maybe awareness will produce action, but the ruins stay hidden. The evidence remains ambiguous. The location shifts depending on who's looking. And meanwhile, the water keeps rising. The ice keeps melting. The temperatures keep climbing. The inequality keeps widening. The tensions keep escalating. The systems keep straining. And we keep searching for Atlantis in the ocean instead of recognizing it in the mirror. Because that's the real function of the myth, not to warn us. We've been warned, endlessly, by scientists, historians, philosophers, prophets, poets. The warnings are everywhere. We're drowning in warnings. The function is to displace responsibility, to locate the lessons safely in the past, to make it about them, not us. Ancient people who didn't know better. Primitive civilizations that lacked our sophistication. Lost cultures that made understandable mistakes given their limited knowledge. We get to study their failure from a position of superiority. Shake our heads at their blindness. Marvel at their arrogance. Congratulate ourselves for being more enlightened. And completely miss that we're exhibiting the exact same blindness and arrogance while we do it. The irony is thick enough to choke on, but irony doesn't trigger change. It just makes good commentary. So the search continues. Satellites scan the seabed. Submersibles explore underwater formations. Archaeologists excavate sites that might, possibly, if you squint, support the Atlantis narrative. Each discovery gets announced with breathless excitement. Could this be it? Is this finally proof? Have we found the lost civilization? Then the analysis comes in. The dating doesn't match. The location doesn't fit. The evidence points elsewhere. The excitement deflates. The search moves on. But it never ends, because ending the search would mean accepting one of two conclusions. Either Atlantis never existed, which makes the whole enterprise pointless, or Atlantis did exist, which means the warning is real and we're actively ignoring it. Neither option is comfortable. So we stay in the middle, searching but never finding, seeking but never concluding, investigating but never resolving. It's the perfect state for a myth. Alive but not active, present but not pressing, relevant but not urgent. We get all the psychological benefits of engaging with the story without any of the uncomfortable implications of actually believing it. And the story adapts. It always adapts. Ancient Atlantis becomes technologically advanced Atlantis. Sunken continent becomes hidden dimension. Natural disaster becomes nuclear war. The specifics shift to match contemporary anxieties. But the core remains. We were great. We fell. The fall was our own fault. Could happen again. Won't happen to us. Probably. That probably is doing a lot of work. It's carrying the entire weight of our denial, our hope, our refusal to fully accept what we know. We understand collapse is possible. We've seen it happen repeatedly throughout history. We're watching it happen in real time to ecosystems, species, communities. We know it's not a question of if, but when, and yet we cling to probably, to maybe, to not in my lifetime, because accepting the inevitability is too much. It's paralyzing. It removes hope. It suggests futility. If collapse is certain, why bother trying to prevent it? Why make sacrifices? Why change behavior? Why do anything except enjoy the present while it lasts? That's the logic that leads to accelerationism, to nihilism, to eating, drinking, and being merry because tomorrow we die. But that's not the only possible response. There's another option. One that's harder, but more honest. Accept the inevitability of endings without accepting the inevitability of timing. Yes, everything falls eventually. But eventually is not now, not yet. Maybe not for centuries. And what happens in the meantime matters. The quality of the decline matters. The grace of the ending matters. Whether we go out with a whimper or a bang matters. Atlantis, in this reading, becomes not a warning, but a template. Here's how it can go. Sudden, catastrophic, complete. Do we want that? Or do we want something different? A slower decline, a managed transition, a conscious choice to step back from the edge rather than being pushed. We might not avoid the fall entirely, but we can influence how we fall. That requires accepting uncomfortable truths. We're not special. We're not exempt. Our technology doesn't make us invincible. Our wealth doesn't make us safe. Our sophistication doesn't make us wise. We're subject to the same forces, the same patterns, the same eventual fate as every civilization before us. The laws of physics don't care about our GDP. The climate doesn't care about our innovations. Nature doesn't negotiate. But within those constraints, we have agency. Not unlimited, not magical, but real. We can choose how to respond, what to prioritize, where to invest resources, how to treat each other, what values to uphold, what systems to build, what future to aim for. The destination might be predetermined. The journey isn't. That's the Atlantis lesson we keep missing. Not don't be like them, but be like them consciously. They built something magnificent. So are we. They reached too far. So are we. They ignored warnings. So are we. They fell. So will we. The question is what we do with that knowledge. Do we pretend it's not happening? Deny the trajectory? Convince ourselves we're different? Or do we look at it clearly, accept it honestly, and decide what matters most in the time we have? Because time is the real resource. Not money, not technology, not power. Time. The years or decades or centuries before the systems we depend on stop functioning. Before the climate becomes unrecognizable. Before the complexity collapses. Before the center cannot hold. That time is limited. It's running out. We can feel it. That's why we're obsessed with Atlantis. Not because we want to find it, because we're afraid of becoming it, and we should be. The fear is rational. The threat is real. The trajectory is clear. But fear alone doesn't help. It needs to transform into something actionable, something that produces different choices, better priorities, wiser systems, more sustainable relationships, not because it will save us, but because it might buy time. And time is everything. The search for Atlantis, properly understood, is the search for that transformation, not in the ocean, in ourselves, not in the past, in the present, not in ruins, in choices. Every expedition that scans the seabed is really asking, can we change? Every theory that places Atlantis in a new location is really asking, can we learn? Every documentary that explores the mystery is really asking, can we be different? The answer is yes and no. Yes, we can change individual behaviors, make personal choices, adjust our own lives. No, we can't change the larger systems without collective action, without political will, without economic restructuring, without cultural shift. And those are harder, much harder, possibly too hard, but possibly is not certainly. And that gap, that tiny space between possible and impossible, is where hope lives. Not naive hope, not blind optimism, not faith that everything will work out, but stubborn, clear-eyed, determined hope that refuses to give up even when the odds are terrible. The kind of hope that builds lifeboats while the ship is sinking, that plants trees knowing you'll never sit in their shade, that fights battles knowing you might lose, because the alternative is surrender, and surrender guarantees the outcome you're trying to avoid. Atlantis sank. That's the story. But before it sank, it existed. People lived there, built things, loved each other, created beauty, experienced joy, made meaning. For however long it lasted, it was real. It mattered. The ending doesn't erase that, doesn't make it meaningless. The fall doesn't retroactively void the rise. And maybe that's enough. Maybe that has to be enough, because it's all we get. This moment, this civilization, this brief, brilliant, doomed experiment. We can spend it searching for lost continents, or we can spend it building something worth losing, Respond in English. The ocean doesn't care about our philosophies. It keeps whatever secrets it holds without judgment, without mercy, without consideration for human curiosity. Every wave that crashes against a research vessel is indifferent. Every current that shifts sediment is mechanical. The search continues anyway because humans are pattern-seeking creatures who cannot accept mystery without attempting resolution. The technology has improved dramatically since the first expeditions. Side-scan sonar can now map entire sections of seafloor in stunning detail. Magnetometers detect metallic anomalies buried deep beneath mud and sand. Submersibles equipped with high-definition cameras descend to depths that would have seemed impossible decades ago. The tools are extraordinary. The results remain frustratingly inconclusive. Each expedition discovers something: ancient shipwrecks, underwater volcanic formations, geological features that suggest past tectonic activity, evidence of human settlement along ancient coastlines now submerged. But none of it is Atlantis. None of it matches the grand description Plato provided. The cities, the temples, the concentric rings, the advanced civilization that supposedly dominated the Mediterranean. What they find instead is harder to categorize. Structures that might be natural, formations that could be man-made, patterns that suggest intention but lack definitive proof. The Bimini Road off the Bahamas, perfectly rectangular stones arranged in what looks like a pathway. Geologists argue it's beach rock, a natural formation created by chemical processes. Alternative researchers see deliberate construction, evidence of sophisticated engineering. Both sides have data. Neither can definitively prove the other wrong. Similar discoveries appear across the Mediterranean, off the coast of Spain, near Cyprus, around Crete, underwater ruins that predate recorded history but don't quite fit the Atlantis narrative. They're too small, too scattered, too ordinary. They speak to human habitation, yes, but not to empire. Not to the technological marvel Plato described. The gap between expectation and evidence creates space for interpretation. And interpretation creates controversy. Because when you can't prove something definitively, belief becomes a choice. Some researchers choose to see every anomaly as potential evidence. Others dismiss anything that doesn't meet rigorous archaeological standards. The middle ground shrinks. The debate intensifies. The truth remains submerged, but here's what the expeditions have proven beyond doubt. The Mediterranean was drastically different 12,000 years ago. Sea levels were lower, coastlines extended much farther. What is now underwater was once dry land, inhabited, cultivated, built upon. The Ice Age ended, the glaciers melted, the oceans rose, entire landscapes disappeared beneath the waves, taking whatever human settlements existed there with them. This isn't speculation, it's established geological fact. We know the Mediterranean basin experienced catastrophic flooding multiple times throughout prehistory. We know coastal populations were displaced. We know entire regions went from habitable to submerged within human lifespans. The physical evidence for this is overwhelming. What we don't know is how advanced those populations were, how organized, how architecturally sophisticated, whether they had writing, whether they had metallurgy, whether they traded across vast distances or remained isolated in small communities. The underwater archaeology provides hints, but rarely delivers conclusions. Consider the difficulty. You're searching for evidence of a civilization that existed over 11,000 years ago, potentially destroyed by geological catastrophe, now buried under meters of sediment in one of the most geologically active regions on Earth. The Mediterranean floor shifts constantly. Tectonic plates grind together. Volcanic activity reshapes the landscape. Earthquakes trigger underwater landslides. Currents move sediment endlessly. Any structures that survived the initial catastrophe have been subjected to millennia of additional destruction. Stone blocks scatter, foundations crumble, organic materials decay completely. What remains, if anything remains, would be fragmentary at best, unrecognizable at worst. The odds of finding intact ruins are vanishingly small. Yet researchers keep looking, not because they're naive, because the possibility, however remote, justifies the effort, because even fragmentary evidence would reshape our understanding of prehistory, because proving or disproving Atlantis definitively would answer questions that have haunted human imagination for over 2 millennia. The search has produced unexpected benefits. Mapping the Mediterranean floor advances oceanography. Discovering prehistoric settlements, Atlantis or not, illuminates human history. Developing better underwater technology has applications far beyond archaeology. The pursuit generates knowledge even when it doesn't achieve its primary objective. Some expeditions focus on specific locations mentioned in ancient texts. Others use probability models based on geological data, mapping where catastrophic events most likely occurred and targeting those regions. A few employ less conventional methods, analyzing astronomical alignments or mythological patterns across cultures. The approaches vary wildly. The results remain elusive. The most promising discoveries often fall apart under scrutiny. What looked like a wall becomes a natural rock formation. What seemed like a road turns out to be fractured limestone. What appeared to be a temple foundation is revealed as volcanic activity. Pattern recognition is powerful but prone to error. The human brain sees faces in clouds and intention in randomness. Underwater archaeology magnifies this tendency. Skeptics argue the entire enterprise is futile, that searching for a fictional place wastes resources that could advance legitimate archaeology, that Plato's story was allegory, not history, and treating it as a treasure map misunderstands its purpose. They're not wrong. The evidence supporting Atlantis as a real place is thin. The evidence suggesting it's philosophical fiction is substantial. But the search continues because certainty is uncomfortable. We want resolution. We want the mystery solved. We want to know whether Plato was recording history or inventing metaphor. And until we know definitively, the question persists. The expeditions continue. The theories multiply. The debate endures. What's fascinating isn't whether Atlantis existed. It's why we need it to have existed. Why the idea of a lost civilization resonates so deeply that we invest millions of dollars and decades of effort searching for proof. Why we're more captivated by what we've lost than what we've built. Why the past seems more impressive than the present. Perhaps because the past is finished, complete. We can romanticize it without confronting its messiness. We can imagine it was better, wiser, more advanced without evidence contradicting us. The present is too immediate, too flawed, too obviously imperfect. But the past, especially the lost past, can be anything we want it to be. Atlantis becomes a mirror. We project onto it whatever we feel is missing from our own civilization. If we value technology, Atlantis had superior technology. If we value spirituality, Atlantis had enlightened spirituality. If we value environmental harmony, Atlantis lived in balance with nature. The story adapts to reflect contemporary anxieties and aspirations. In the 1960s, during the space race, theories emerged that Atlantis had advanced aviation, possibly even spaceflight. In the 1970s, amid environmental movements, Atlantis became an eco-utopia destroyed by ecological hubris. In the 1990s, as computers proliferated, Atlantis gained sophisticated information systems. In the 2000s, alternative medicine proponents claimed Atlantis had crystal healing technology. The myth evolves with cultural preoccupations. This adaptability ensures its survival. Atlantis never becomes outdated because it's never specifically defined. Plato provided just enough detail to spark imagination, but not enough to pin down. Everything else is interpretation, projection, creative elaboration. The story is a framework we fill with our own meanings, which brings us back to the ocean. All those expeditions, all that technology, all those hours of scanning empty seafloor. What are they really searching for? Ruins or validation? Proof that advanced civilizations existed before ours? Evidence that we're not the first to reach these heights? Reassurance that if they could build something magnificent and lose it, maybe our own precarious position isn't so shameful? The ocean doesn't answer. It keeps its secrets. And maybe that's appropriate. Maybe some mysteries serve us better unsolved. Maybe the search itself is the point, not the discovery. Maybe asking the question matters more than finding the answer. Because the real question isn't where is Atlantis? It's what do we do with the fact that civilizations fall, that everything built can be destroyed, that progress isn't guaranteed, that the arc of history doesn't naturally bend toward anything except entropy. How do we live with that knowledge? How do we build anyway? How do we create meaning in the face of inevitable decay? Atlantis offers no answers. Just the reminder that others face these questions before us, that they built anyway, that their creation mattered, even though it didn't last, that the work itself held value independent of its longevity. The archaeologists descending in submersibles probably don't think about this. They're focused on sonar readings, sediment samples, coordinate mapping, the technical work of searching. But beneath that practical focus runs a deeper current, a need to connect with something larger than themselves, to participate in a story that transcends their individual lives. Every dive is an act of hope. Hope that this time will be different, that this location will yield something conclusive, that the mystery will finally resolve. The hope persists despite repeated disappointment, despite the overwhelming probability of failure, despite the rational understanding that Atlantis, if it existed at all, is likely gone beyond recovery. This kind of hope isn't naive. It's defiant. It refuses to accept that some questions can't be answered. It insists on trying anyway. It values the pursuit even when the prize remains forever out of reach. It's the same hope that drives all exploration, all research, all human attempts to understand the unknown. The ocean floor holds countless secrets: lost ships, undiscovered species, geological formations never seen by human eyes, ancient settlements from cultures we barely understand, evidence of past catastrophes, clues to future ones. The Mediterranean alone could occupy researchers for centuries without exhausting its mysteries. Atlantis is just one mystery among many, perhaps not even the most important one, but it's the one that captures imagination most powerfully, the one that generates funding, the one that inspires young researchers to pursue careers in marine archaeology, the one that keeps expeditions launching despite decades of inconclusive results. In this sense, whether Atlantis existed becomes almost irrelevant. The story's power lies not in its historical accuracy, but in its cultural function. It keeps us searching, questioning, exploring, refusing to accept that the past is fully known or the ocean fully mapped. It maintains wonder in an age of Google Earth and satellite imagery. It insists mystery still exists even when information seems infinite. And there's value in that. Real value. Because the moment we believe everything is known, exploration stops. Innovation stagnates. Curiosity dies. The unknown, even the possibly fictional unknown, keeps us humble, keeps us searching, keeps us acknowledging how much we don't understand about our own planet, our own history, our own capabilities. The expeditions will continue. New technology will enable deeper dives, more detailed scans, better analysis. Each generation of researchers will bring fresh perspectives and improved tools. Some will find evidence they consider compelling. Others will dismiss it. The debate will persist. The mystery will endure. Because ultimately, Atlantis isn't hiding in the ocean. It's living in the questions we ask about it, in the search itself, in the tension between what we hope to find and what we fear we've already lost. The story survives not because evidence supports it, but because we need it to survive. We need to believe that greatness is possible, that humans can achieve extraordinary things, that civilization can reach dazzling heights. And yes, we need to remember that it can all fall, that nothing is permanent, that every empire eventually crumbles. Both truths matter. Both shape how we move forward. The researchers scanning the Mediterranean floor are searching for more than ruins. They're searching for context, for perspective, for evidence that our current moment, however unprecedented it feels, fits into a longer pattern, that we're not alone in our achievements or our anxieties, that the human experiment has always involved building, losing, and building again. Whether they find Atlantis doesn't change that pattern. The search itself confirms it. The search for Atlantis reveals something deeper about how we process loss. Not just historical loss, but the kind that haunts every civilization. The fear that our greatest achievements might vanish without trace. That future generations might doubt we existed at all. That everything we build could become the next mystery someone tries to solve with incomplete evidence and passionate debate. Ancient texts describe Atlantis with specificity that feels deliberate. The measurements, the layout, the resources. Plato wasn't vague. He gave dimensions for the city's rings, distances between features, details about the harbour and the plain beyond. This precision creates a problem for dismissive skeptics. If he invented everything, why include such granular detail? Fiction usually stays broader, lets imagination fill gaps, but Plato's account reads almost like a surveyor's report, clinical, measured, oddly practical for pure fantasy, unless he was working from something real. Not necessarily a fallen empire matching his moral tale, but perhaps fragments of genuine geography, stories about actual places, real disasters compressed and reimagined into cautionary allegory. Ancient writers often blended fact and fiction so thoroughly that separating them becomes impossible. They didn't share our obsession with categorical truth. A story could be false in specifics, yet true in essence, useful regardless of historical accuracy. This approach frustrates modern researchers trained to demand binary answers. Either it happened or it didn't. Either evidence exists or the story is worthless. But ancient philosophy operated differently. Truth wasn't confined to literal events. A fabricated story, teaching genuine wisdom, held more value than accurate records teaching nothing. So asking whether Atlantis really existed might be the wrong question entirely. The better question, what real knowledge is embedded in this tale, regardless of its historical basis? Geologists studying ancient catastrophes find patterns that align uncomfortably well with Atlantis descriptions. Sudden inundations, earthquakes triggering massive flooding, volcanic eruptions burying civilizations overnight. These events happened repeatedly throughout human history. Santorini devastated Minoan culture. The Black Sea flooded dramatically as glaciers melted. Coastal settlements vanished when sea levels rose. Entire populations displaced by disasters they couldn't predict or prevent. Any of these could have inspired elements of Plato's story. A grandfather's tale about a port city swallowed by waves, trade routes disrupted by seismic destruction, refugees arriving with stories of homes lost to forces beyond comprehension, oral traditions preserving fragments of genuine catastrophe, embellished through centuries of retelling until the original event becomes unrecognizable. This happens constantly in folklore. Real disasters morph into legends. Historical figures become mythical heroes. Actual wars transform into cosmic battles between good and evil. The Mediterranean offers countless candidates for Atlantean inspiration. Coastal cities that thrived, then vanished. Islands that changed shape dramatically. Harbours buried by earthquakes. Each has defenders claiming their site as the true Atlantis. Each presents evidence that feels compelling until examined closely. Then problems emerge. Dates don't match. Scale is wrong. Cultural details clash with Plato's description. But perhaps that's because we're searching for exact correspondence when we should be looking for thematic echoes. Consider how modern disasters become legend, even with documentation. Pompeii buried by Vesuvius is historical fact. Yet ask random people about it, and details blur. Timelines shift. Events merge with other disasters. Now imagine that story passed down orally for generations without photographs, without written records, with only memory and retelling. How recognizable would the actual event remain after 500 years? 1,000. This is what makes the search both frustrating and fascinating. We're not just hunting for ruins, we're trying to reverse engineer folklore back into fact, to extract historical truth from stories that have been filtered through countless retellings, each adding embellishments, removing inconvenient details, adjusting facts to fit contemporary understanding. It's archaeology performed on narrative itself, excavating layers of interpretation to reach whatever bedrock might exist underneath. The tools for this work are improving. Underwater archaeology has advanced dramatically. Sonar mapping reveals seafloor details invisible to earlier generations. Remote-operated vehicles explore depths humans can't reach. Analysis techniques can date organic material, identify source locations for building materials, reconstruct ancient coastlines. We can see more, measure better, understand deeper than ever before. Yet Atlantis remains elusive. This persistence of mystery in an age of advanced technology says something important. Some questions resist answers not because evidence is lacking, but because the question itself is malformed. Asking where Atlantis is assumes it was a specific place. But what if it was always a composite? Multiple locations, various disasters, different time periods, all compressed into a single narrative because that's how human memory works. We simplify, we combine, we create coherent stories from scattered experiences. Modern researchers sometimes forget this. They approach ancient texts expecting them to function like modern journalism. Clear facts, verifiable sources, distinction between observation and interpretation. But ancient writers served different purposes. They preserved wisdom, not data. They taught lessons, not chronology. Accuracy mattered less than meaning. So Plato might have gathered genuine information about real places and real disasters, then deliberately reshaped everything into a philosophical argument about hubris and divine justice. If so, searching for the real Atlantis is like trying to find the actual town that inspired a novel. Elements exist. Settings have real counterparts. But the author combined them, changed them, used them as raw material for something new. The creation becomes real in its own way, more culturally significant than its sources. The search for those sources becomes archaeology of imagination rather than dirt. Yet physical evidence keeps emerging that refuses to fit neatly into either category. Structures underwater that shouldn't exist. Artifacts in unexpected locations. Anomalies that demand explanation. Most turn out to be natural formations or misidentified objects. But occasionally, something surfaces that genuinely puzzles experts. Not proof of Atlantis, just proof that our understanding of ancient maritime cultures remains incomplete, that conventional chronologies might need adjustment, that assumptions about technological capabilities may be wrong. These discoveries don't validate Atlantis, but they complicate dismissal. They suggest ancient peoples achieved more than we credit them with, that maritime trade networks were more extensive, that civilizations rose and fell, leaving minimal trace, that our historical narrative has gaps where entire cultures might hide. This creates space for Atlantis to exist, not as Plato described it, but as something smaller, more ordinary, yet still real. A successful port city, a prosperous island culture, a maritime power that dominated regional trade before disaster struck. Stripped of exaggeration, this seems plausible, even likely. The Mediterranean hosted many such places. Some we know about, others we've lost entirely. Climate change, sea level rise, tectonic activity, and simple passage of time have erased countless settlements. Most left no written records. Their names are forgotten, their achievements unremembered. They vanish so completely that proving they existed at all requires painstaking archaeology and considerable luck. Perhaps Atlantis was simply one of these, significant in its time, destroyed dramatically enough to generate stories, but not actually the super civilization of legend. Just a normal city that got mythologized over centuries until it transformed into something unrecognizable. The way a minor skirmish becomes an epic battle in retelling. The way a competent leader becomes a legendary hero. The way a bad storm becomes divine punishment. Exaggeration is how oral tradition works. It's not lying, it's emphasis. Making sure the lesson survives even if the facts don't. This interpretation disappoints believers and skeptics equally. Believers want the advanced civilization, the lost wisdom, the proof that ancients achieved greatness matching or exceeding our own. Skeptics want clean dismissal, proof it never existed, validation that they were right to scoff. But history usually lives in the complicated middle, partially true, partially exaggerated, impossible to verify completely, but equally impossible to dismiss entirely. The expeditions continue because researchers understand this. They're not expecting to find Plato's Atlantis intact. That was never realistic. They're hoping to find evidence of whatever inspired the story, proof that some kernel of historical truth underlies the myth, even if that truth is disappointingly ordinary, even if it's just another Bronze Age settlement that suffered the fate of countless others. The discovery would still matter because it would anchor folklore to fact. It would demonstrate that legends, however distorted, often preserve genuine memory. This matters for understanding all ancient texts. If Atlantis has a real basis, what about other legendary places, other lost civilizations, other stories dismissed as pure fiction? The line between myth and history is far blurrier than modern thinking prefers. Our ancestors didn't distinguish sharply between the two. They valued stories that taught truth even when those stories weren't literally true. They preserved knowledge in narrative form because narrative survives when raw data doesn't. So the search for Atlantis is really a search for better methods of reading ancient sources. Learning when to take them literally and when to read between lines. Understanding how oral tradition transforms information. Recognizing what kinds of truth can survive transmission across centuries without written preservation. These are skills that apply far beyond one legendary island. They reshape how we approach all ancient history. The Mediterranean keeps its secrets well. Sediment buries evidence. Currents scatter debris. Time dissolves even stone. What survives is fragmentary, a few walls, some pottery shards, scattered coins. From these fragments, archaeologists reconstruct entire cultures. They infer trade networks, religious practices, social structures, technological capabilities. It's detective work performed on incomplete evidence with no witnesses to question. The fact that we know anything about the ancient world is remarkable. That we know as much as we do is nearly miraculous. Against this background, expecting to find definitive proof of Atlantis seems absurd. We can barely prove the existence of places we know existed. Cities mentioned in multiple texts by various authors. Settlements that left substantial ruins. Cultures that influenced their neighbours. If these barely survive in historical record, how could we possibly verify a place mentioned once, described briefly, potentially fictional from the start? Yet the search persists, because occasionally archaeology delivers the impossible. Troy was dismissed as pure fiction until Schliemann found it. The Hittite Empire was doubted until cuneiform tablets proved it existed. Entire civilizations have been excavated from obscurity because someone refused to accept that absence of evidence meant evidence of absence. Skepticism is valuable. So is determination. The trick is balancing both, demanding evidence while remaining open to surprise. Atlantis may never be found. The likelihood decreases with each failed expedition. But the search has already generated tremendous value. It's driven technological development, trained researchers, inspired public interest in archaeology and oceanography, funded projects that discovered other significant sites, created careers, advanced understanding of ancient cultures, even when those cultures weren't Atlantean. Sometimes the journey matters more than the destination. Sometimes searching teaches more than finding. This isn't consolation for failure. It's recognition that exploration has intrinsic value beyond its stated goal. The Apollo program aimed for the moon, but generated countless secondary innovations. Medical research seeking one cure often stumbles into others. Physics experiments designed to test specific theories reveal unexpected phenomena. The same pattern holds in archaeology. You rarely find exactly what you're seeking, but you find something, and that something often proves more valuable than your original target. So expeditions searching for Atlantis continue discovering the Mediterranean's other secrets. Ancient shipwrecks carrying trade goods that rewrite commercial history, submerged settlements revealing how coastal peoples adapted to rising seas, evidence of tsunamis, earthquakes, volcanic eruptions that shaped civilizations, proof that the ancient world was more interconnected, more sophisticated, more resilient and more vulnerable than textbooks suggest. None of this is Atlantis. All of it matters. The researchers know this. They're not naive. They understand the odds. But they also understand that unlikely doesn't mean impossible. That most major discoveries seemed impossible right until they happened. That the absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, merely evidence that we haven't looked effectively yet. That new technology enables searches impossible for previous generations. That what we can't find today might be obvious tomorrow. This is the real reason the search endures. Not blind faith in Plato's account. Not desperation to prove skeptics wrong, but the fundamental human conviction that mysteries can be solved if we're persistent enough, creative enough, lucky enough. That the universe yields its secrets to those who ask the right questions in the right ways. That today's impossibility is tomorrow's textbook fact. That the search itself, regardless of outcome, expands human knowledge and capability in ways that justify the effort. Modern technology has transformed the search for Atlantis from fantasy into systematic investigation. Satellite imaging now maps ocean floors in unprecedented detail. Sonar systems penetrate sediment layers that hide ancient coastlines. Ground-penetrating radar reveals buried structures without excavation. Magnetometers detect anomalies indicating human construction. Remote-operated vehicles explore depths previously inaccessible. Autonomous underwater drones survey vast areas efficiently. LiDAR scanning penetrates jungle canopy to expose forgotten cities. Each advancement expands the searchable territory exponentially. The Mediterranean alone contains thousands of unexplored archaeological sites. Most remain untouched, not because they're uninteresting, but because resources are limited. Every excavation requires funding, expertise, time, permits, equipment, logistics. Underwater archaeology is particularly expensive. Operating at depth demands specialized vessels, trained divers, preservation facilities, conservation experts. A single season can cost millions. Most projects focus on known sites with guaranteed returns. Chasing Atlantis means gambling resources on uncertain outcomes. Yet private expeditions continue. Wealthy enthusiasts fund searches traditional institutions won't. Some are serious researchers applying rigorous methodology. Others are treasure hunters hoping for fame and artifacts. A few are true believers convinced they'll succeed where others failed. The quality varies dramatically. Legitimate archaeological work follows strict protocols. Document everything. Preserve context. Publish findings. Submit to peer review. Respect local laws and international conventions. Treasure hunters often ignore these standards, destroying archaeological value while extracting sellable items. This creates tension within the community. Professional archaeologists resent amateurs who contaminate sites with poor technique. Amateur explorers resent academics who gatekeep knowledge and dismiss unconventional theories. Both sides have valid points. Academia sometimes becomes too conservative, rejecting ideas that later prove correct. Amateurs sometimes lack training that prevents them from recognizing what they've actually found. The ideal approach combines academic rigor with explorer enthusiasm. Respect evidence while remaining open to surprises. Several recent discoveries demonstrate this balance. Off the coast of Sicily, researchers found evidence of a massive ancient landslide that generated a tsunami devastating coastal settlements. The event matches descriptions in various ancient texts previously considered exaggerated. The discovery didn't prove those texts described Atlantis, but it proved catastrophic events did occur, lending credibility to the general concept of civilizations destroyed by natural disaster. Near Crete, excavations revealed Minoan settlements buried under volcanic ash. The preservation was extraordinary. Buildings stood largely intact. Frescoes retained their colors. Storage jars still contained food residue. The eruption had frozen a moment in time, creating an archaeological treasure. Again, this wasn't Atlantis, but it was a sophisticated Bronze Age civilization annihilated by a volcanic disaster, exactly the type of event Plato described. In the Black Sea, oceanographers discovered ancient shorelines now submerged hundreds of feet deep. These weren't gradual changes. Evidence suggested catastrophic flooding when rising Mediterranean waters breached the Bosphorus, transforming a freshwater lake into a saltwater sea. Coastal settlements would have vanished overnight. Survivors would have fled carrying stories of lands swallowed by floods. This event predated Plato by thousands of years, but it demonstrated that flood myths might preserve genuine historical memories. Each discovery refines understanding of what's possible. Ancient peoples were more capable than previously assumed. They built larger structures, sailed farther, traded more extensively, survived greater catastrophes, and adapted more successfully than traditional models suggested. The ancient world was more connected and more dynamic than the textbook version portrays. This doesn't prove Atlantis existed, but it makes the concept less absurd. The psychological appeal of Atlantis endures partly because it represents lost potential. A civilization that achieved greatness then vanished completely. Knowledge that could have advanced humanity but was destroyed before it could spread. Technology that might have prevented centuries of slower development. It's the ultimate cautionary tale about fragility. No matter how advanced, how powerful, how sophisticated a society becomes, it remains vulnerable to forces beyond its control. This resonates in the modern era, we possess capabilities our ancestors couldn't imagine. Yet we face existential threats they never considered. Climate change, nuclear weapons, pandemics, artificial intelligence, asteroid impacts. Our civilization feels simultaneously invincible and precarious. We've landed on the moon, but can't prevent political dysfunction. We've decoded genetics, but struggle with misinformation. We've connected globally, but remain tribally divided. Atlantis serves as a mirror. We project contemporary anxieties onto ancient legends. When people fear climate change, Atlantis becomes a warning about environmental catastrophe. When they worry about moral decay, Atlantis represents divine punishment for hubris. When they distrust elites, Atlantis becomes evidence of suppressed ancient wisdom. The legend adapts to whatever concerns dominate the cultural moment. This flexibility explains its persistence. Unlike specific historical claims that can be definitively disproven, Atlantis remains vague enough to accommodate new interpretations. When one location is eliminated, proponents simply move it elsewhere. When one timeline is disproven, they adjust the dates. When one explanation fails, they propose alternatives. The legend evolves faster than debunking can keep pace. Skeptics find this frustrating. They've refuted Atlantis countless times using geology, archaeology, linguistics, logic, yet belief persists. From a scientific standpoint, this seems irrational. From a psychological standpoint, it makes perfect sense. Humans need mysteries. We need stories. We need to believe the world contains undiscovered wonders. Atlantis provides all three. There's also the allure of being right when experts are wrong. Discovering Atlantis would be the ultimate vindication. Every amateur who's been dismissed, every theory that's been mocked, every enthusiast who's been called delusional, all would be justified in a single moment. This creates powerful motivation to keep searching despite the odds. Professional archaeologists understand this dynamic. Most don't waste energy debating true believers. They focus instead on educating the genuinely curious, explaining how archaeology actually works, demonstrating why certain claims don't withstand scrutiny, teaching people to evaluate evidence critically. This approach is more productive than arguing about whether Atlantis existed. The truth is, we may never know definitively. If Atlantis was purely fictional, no amount of searching will prove it. If it was inspired by a real place, that place may be unrecognizable now. If it was destroyed completely, evidence may not exist. If it's buried under miles of sediment, we may lack technology to find it. If it's in an unexplored location, we might not search there for centuries. But absence of discovery doesn't mean absence of value. The search has already contributed enormously to human knowledge. Marine archaeology advanced dramatically, partly because researchers needed better tools to search underwater. Satellite imaging improved partly because explorers wanted to survey remote areas. Geophysical analysis became more sophisticated, partly because investigators needed to distinguish natural formations from artificial structures. The same pattern appears throughout history. Columbus sought a western route to India and found America instead. Prospectors seeking gold in California triggered mass migration that built the American West. Scientists studying one phenomenon routinely discover others. Failure is only failure if nothing is learned. The Atlantis search has generated tremendous learning. It's also inspired generations of researchers. Many prominent archaeologists, oceanographers, and geologists first became interested in their fields through childhood fascination with Atlantis. The legend serves as a gateway, drawing people towards scientific inquiry. Some eventually conclude Atlantis was fictional. Others remain agnostic. A few continue believing. But regardless of their conclusions, they've been motivated to pursue knowledge, and that motivation has yielded genuine contributions. This educational value extends to the public. Documentaries about Atlantis introduce viewers to legitimate archaeology. Books about the search explain genuine scientific methods. Debates about its existence teach critical thinking. Even if people conclude the legend is false, they've learned how evidence works, how arguments are evaluated, how knowledge is established. These are valuable skills applicable far beyond archaeology. There's also artistic value. Atlantis has inspired countless novels, films, paintings, songs, and games. These works explore themes of hubris, loss, nostalgia, wonder, and human limitation. They ask what it means to build something great and watch it vanish. Whether Atlantis existed historically is almost irrelevant to this artistic function. The legend's power lies in what it represents, not whether it happened. Philosophically, the Atlantis debate raises profound questions. How do we know what we think we know? What constitutes sufficient evidence? When should we accept conventional wisdom versus questioning it? How do we balance skepticism with open-mindedness? These aren't just archaeological questions, they're epistemological ones that affect every field. The search also highlights how narratives shape perception. Plato's dialogues weren't meant as history textbooks. They were philosophical arguments using storytelling. Yet readers transformed them into historical claims. This demonstrates how easily context gets lost, how readily fiction becomes fact, how persistently misunderstanding can spread once established. Consider how many people know Atlantis was real, despite never reading Plato's actual text. They've absorbed the idea through cultural osmosis, secondary sources, popular media. Their knowledge is based on interpretations of interpretations, summaries of summaries, adaptations of adaptations. The original source has been filtered through so many layers that its meaning has fundamentally changed. This happens with many historical claims. Myths become facts through repetition. Speculation becomes certainty through assertion. Theories become truths through popularity. The Atlantis phenomenon is just an especially clear example of a universal problem. We believe things not because we've verified them personally, but because we've heard them repeatedly from sources we trust. Breaking this cycle requires returning to primary sources, reading what Plato actually wrote, examining what evidence actually exists, distinguishing between what's known and what's assumed. This is harder than it sounds. Primary sources are often difficult to access, written in foreign languages, embedded in unfamiliar contexts. Most people lack time or training to evaluate them properly, so they rely on experts. But experts disagree. Mainstream archaeologists say Atlantis was fictional. Fringe researchers say it was real. The public must choose whom to trust, often based on factors unrelated to evidence. Who seems more credible? Whose argument is more compelling? Whose conclusion is more appealing? This creates space for motivated reasoning. People believe what they want to believe and find experts who agree. Confirmation bias ensures they notice evidence supporting their view while dismissing contradictions. Cognitive dissonance prevents them from seriously considering alternatives. The result is entrenched positions resistant to change regardless of evidence. Yet occasionally, someone changes their mind. A believer encounters evidence they can't ignore. A skeptic discovers information that challenges assumptions. These moments of genuine intellectual honesty are rare but significant. They demonstrate that truth can overcome bias when people are willing to follow evidence wherever it leads. The Atlantis debate needs more such honesty. Believers should acknowledge weaknesses in their theories. Skeptics should admit gaps in knowledge. Both should recognize that certainty is often unwarranted. The honest position on Atlantis might be, we don't know, and we may never know. But the question remains interesting regardless. This uncertainty bothers many people. They want definitive answers. They want closure. They want the mystery solved. But some mysteries may be unsolvable. Some questions may lack answers. Some debates may continue indefinitely because insufficient evidence exists to resolve them. Learning to live with uncertainty is a valuable skill. It prevents premature conclusions. It maintains intellectual humility. It keeps minds open to new information. It acknowledges that reality is more complex than our models suggest. The Atlantis debate, frustrating though it may be, teaches this lesson effectively. Perhaps that's the real value of the legend. Not whether Atlantis existed, but what the search reveals about human nature. Our need for mystery, our capacity for wonder, our determination to solve puzzles, our willingness to question authority, our tendency toward wishful thinking, our ability to deceive ourselves, our potential for genuine discovery. Atlantis is a mirror reflecting whoever looks into it. Believers see evidence of ancient wisdom. Skeptics see human gullibility. Romantics see lost beauty. Scientists see methodology problems. Philosophers see epistemological questions. Artists see creative inspiration. Each perspective contains truth. None contains the whole truth. The story endures because it accommodates multiple interpretations simultaneously. It's a historical mystery, a philosophical parable, a literary masterpiece, an archaeological puzzle, a psychological phenomenon, and a cultural touchstone. No single explanation captures its full significance. That complexity ensures Atlantis will outlive current debates. Long after today's archaeologists and enthusiasts are gone, people will still wonder about the lost civilization Plato described. They'll still search oceans and analyze texts. They'll still argue about evidence and meaning. The legend has survived 2 millennia. It will likely survive several more. Resilient human. You are an expert YouTube scriptwriter that writes scripts in your own words. You will be creating scripts that will be read aloud by a text-to-speech AI directly. Ensure your output has proper punctuation and does not plagiarize. Do not include any parenthetical text or stage directions. Do not include a title or headers. Output the script only, no commentary or additional text. 200,000. The question of why Atlantis matters extends beyond archaeology or history. It touches something fundamental about how humans construct meaning. We create narratives to explain the world, and those narratives shape what we consider possible. Atlantis represents the ultimate narrative of lost potential, a civilization that achieved greatness then vanished completely. That story resonates because it mirrors personal and collective fears about impermanence. Every culture has decline narratives. Rome fell. Egypt faded. Greece diminished. These aren't just historical facts. They're warnings embedded in cultural memory. Atlantis amplifies this pattern by adding total erasure. Not just decline, but disappearance. Not just defeat, but obliteration. The civilization doesn't gradually fade. It sinks beneath waves in a single day and night, leaving almost nothing behind. This extreme version of loss creates powerful emotional responses. It suggests that everything can disappear. That achievement means nothing against nature's power. That civilizations, regardless of sophistication, remain vulnerable to forces beyond control. These themes explain why the story appears across cultures that never encountered Plato's dialogues. The concept emerges independently because the fear is universal. But there's another dimension. Atlantis isn't just about loss. It's about hidden knowledge. The survivors who escaped supposedly carried wisdom to other lands, seeding civilizations elsewhere. This transforms tragedy into origin story. Instead of ending with destruction, the narrative continues through dispersed remnants. Lost knowledge becomes recoverable. Vanished wisdom might resurface. The civilization may be gone, but its influence persists. This aspect attracts people frustrated with mainstream narratives. They see gaps in archaeological records and wonder what's missing. They notice architectural similarities across distant cultures and question coincidence. They observe sophisticated ancient achievements and doubt conventional explanations. Atlantis provides a framework explaining these anomalies. If an advanced precursor civilization existed, connections make sense. Gaps become evidence of forgotten history rather than absence of data. The problem is, this framework can explain anything. Any unexplained artifact becomes Atlantean. Any architectural mystery becomes evidence of lost technology. Any cultural similarity becomes proof of common origin. The theory becomes unfalsifiable because it accommodates all data. This makes it intellectually useless while remaining emotionally satisfying. It answers questions without providing testable predictions. It explains everything while clarifying nothing. Science requires specificity. A useful theory makes predictions that could prove wrong. If those predictions succeed, the theory gains support. If they fail, it requires revision or abandonment. Atlantis theories rarely work this way. They absorb contradictory evidence by expanding scope. If Atlantis wasn't in the Mediterranean, maybe it was in the Atlantic. If not the Atlantic, perhaps Antarctica. If not Antarctica, possibly Indonesia. The location shifts to accommodate new information rather than testing against it. This flexibility reveals the theory's true function. It's not really about finding a lost civilization. It's about maintaining belief in one. The search becomes its own reward. The mystery justifies continued investigation. The possibility keeps hope alive. Proving Atlantis existed matters less than keeping the question open. Closure would end the adventure. Compare this to legitimate archaeological mysteries. Göbekli Tepe sat buried for millennia until its discovery shocked researchers. The site challenged assumptions about human development, showing complex construction predated agriculture. This wasn't predicted by existing theories. It forced revisions. Scholars adjusted their models because evidence demanded it. The discovery advanced knowledge by contradicting expectations. Atlantis doesn't work that way. Believers rarely specify what would disprove their claims. They don't establish clear criteria for evidence. They don't define predictions that might fail. Instead, they point to unexplained phenomena and claim Atlantis as the explanation. This backwards reasoning starts with the conclusion, then searches for support. It's precisely what scientific method aims to prevent. Yet dismissing believers as simply irrational misses something important. Many are genuinely curious people frustrated with perceived limitations in mainstream archaeology. They notice that academic consensus changes over time. They observe that experts once dismissed ideas now accepted. They recognize that authority doesn't guarantee truth. These observations are valid. The problem isn't skepticism toward experts. It's replacing one set of unsupported beliefs with another. The healthiest approach combines openness with rigor. Yes, academic consensus might be wrong about specific claims. Yes, discoveries sometimes overturn established models. Yes, experts have blind spots and biases. But replacing mainstream narratives requires evidence meeting the same standards we demand of any claim. Extraordinary assertions need extraordinary support. This principle applies equally to conventional and alternative theories. Atlantis believers often complain about double standards. They argue mainstream archaeology accepts weak evidence for accepted theories while demanding impossible proof for alternative ones. Sometimes this criticism has merit. Academics do occasionally show bias toward ideas fitting existing frameworks. But the solution isn't lowering standards for alternative theories. It's maintaining high standards for all claims while remaining open to revising conclusions when evidence warrants. This requires intellectual discipline. It means distinguishing between "we don't know" and "therefore my preferred explanation is correct." Gaps in knowledge are just gaps. They don't automatically validate specific alternatives. The absence of explanation A doesn't prove explanation B. Multiple possibilities might exist, or the true answer might be something nobody has considered yet. The Atlantis debate would benefit from this nuance. Instead of believers versus skeptics, imagine a spectrum. On one end are those certain Atlantis existed, essentially as Plato described. On the other are those certain it's entirely fictional. Between these extremes lie more modest positions. Maybe Plato based his story on real events but embellished extensively. Maybe he combined multiple sources into one narrative. Maybe he invented most details but borrowed some elements from actual history. Maybe the story is pure fiction but resonates because it captures timeless themes. These moderate positions seem less exciting than definitive claims. They don't promise revolutionary discoveries or vindicate cherished beliefs. They acknowledge uncertainty and complexity. They resist simple answers. But they're probably closer to truth than extreme positions. Most historical questions lack clean resolution. Evidence is fragmentary. Interpretations vary. Certainty is rare. Accepting this uncertainty doesn't mean abandoning curiosity. It means pursuing questions with appropriate humility. It means following evidence rather than forcing it to support predetermined conclusions. It means being willing to change your mind when new information emerges. These practices don't guarantee correct answers, but they improve the odds of avoiding wrong ones. The Atlantis legend will continue inspiring people regardless of evidence. Its power comes from tapping into deep psychological needs, the desire to believe in lost wisdom, the hope that mysteries remain unsolved, the appeal of hidden knowledge, the romance of vanished civilizations. These motivations don't disappear when confronted with archaeological reality. They exist independently of factual questions. Perhaps that's actually fine. Stories serve functions beyond conveying facts. They inspire imagination. They encourage exploration. They make people question assumptions. They spark interest in history and archaeology. Many professionals credit childhood fascination with Atlantis for starting their careers. The legend acts as a gateway drug to legitimate historical inquiry. If some people move from entertaining possibilities to demanding rigorous evidence, the myth serves a valuable purpose regardless of its truth. The danger comes when belief becomes identity, when finding Atlantis transforms from interesting question into personal crusade, when contradictory evidence triggers defensiveness rather than reconsideration, when the search becomes about being right rather than discovering truth. This shift happens gradually. Initial curiosity hardens into conviction. Questions become assertions. Possibilities become certainties. And the person who started with genuine wonder ends up trapped in unfalsifiable beliefs. Breaking this pattern requires recognizing it early, maintaining perspective, remembering that being wrong about Atlantis doesn't invalidate your intelligence or curiosity, that changing your mind based on evidence demonstrates strength rather than weakness, that following where data leads, even if it's disappointing, matters more than confirming what you hoped was true. These principles extend beyond Atlantis to any controversial topic. How do we evaluate competing claims? How do we assess evidence? How do we balance openness with skepticism? How do we avoid both cynical dismissal and credulous acceptance? These questions define rational inquiry. Getting them right matters for issues far more consequential than lost civilizations. Climate change debates mirror Atlantis discussions in interesting ways. Both involve complex evidence requiring expertise to interpret. Both feature motivated reasoning on multiple sides. Both include people certain they're right, despite limited understanding. Both suffer from polarization, preventing productive dialogue. The parallel isn't perfect, but it reveals similar psychological patterns. People want simple narratives, clear villains and heroes, obvious solutions to complex problems, definitive answers to difficult questions. But reality rarely cooperates. Evidence is messy, experts disagree. Easy answers usually miss important nuances. And admitting uncertainty feels like weakness even when it's the most honest position. The Atlantis debate, for all its frustrations, provides a relatively low-stakes arena for practicing better thinking. Nobody's policy decisions depend on whether the civilization existed. No lives hang in the balance. It's a safe space for examining how we form beliefs and evaluate evidence. The habits developed here transfer to more important domains. Learning to say, "I don't know," without discomfort. Recognizing the difference between possibility and probability. Understanding that wanting something to be true doesn't make it so. Distinguishing between skepticism and cynicism. Appreciating that changing your mind based on evidence demonstrates intellectual growth. These skills matter far beyond archaeological debates. Atlantis teaches another valuable lesson about human nature. We're pattern-seeking creatures. Our brains evolved to detect connections, sometimes finding them where none exist. This tendency helped our ancestors survive by identifying threats and opportunities. But it also makes us susceptible to seeing meaningful patterns in random noise. Conspiracy theories, superstitions, and pseudoscience all exploit this cognitive quirk. The antidote isn't suppressing our pattern-seeking instinct. It's training ourselves to test patterns rather than simply accepting them. When you notice a connection, ask what would disprove it. Look for counterexamples. Consider alternative explanations. Check whether the pattern holds under scrutiny or dissolves when examined closely. This discipline feels unnatural because it contradicts intuition. But it's essential for distinguishing real patterns from imaginary ones. Atlantis believers excel at finding patterns, architectural similarities across cultures, flood myths in multiple traditions, advanced knowledge in ancient civilizations. These patterns seem significant. They demand explanation, but pattern recognition is only the first step. The second step is rigorous testing. Do the similarities actually exceed what chance would predict? Are the flood myths similar enough to suggest common origin rather than independent development? Does the ancient knowledge truly surpass what the culture could have developed independently? These questions often receive inadequate attention. The pattern itself seems like evidence, but patterns are easy to find, especially when you're looking for them. The human mind is so good at pattern detection that we see faces in clouds and hear messages in random noise. Pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful images in random stimuli, affects everyone. Recognizing this vulnerability is crucial for evaluating evidence objectively. The strongest arguments for Atlantis acknowledge these challenges. They don't just point to suggestive patterns. They attempt to quantify how unlikely those patterns would be without a connecting explanation. They consider alternative hypotheses. They specify what evidence would contradict their claims. They engage seriously with counterarguments rather than dismissing them. These approaches don't prove Atlantis existed, but they elevate the discussion above mere assertion. Unfortunately, such rigor is rare. Most Atlantis advocacy relies on accumulating suggestive evidence without rigorous analysis. The reasoning seems to be that enough coincidences can't be coincidental, but this misunderstands probability. Given enough opportunities, unlikely things happen regularly. With thousands of ancient sites and artifacts, some will show surprising similarities by chance alone. Identifying which similarities are meaningful requires statistical analysis, not just intuitive assessment. This same issue plagues many controversial claims. Correlation doesn't imply causation, yet people constantly infer causation from correlation. Anecdotes aren't data, yet personal experiences often outweigh statistical evidence. Availability bias makes vivid examples seem more common than they are. Confirmation bias ensures we notice supporting evidence while dismissing contradictions. These cognitive patterns are universal. Nobody is immune. The question is whether we recognize and compensate for them. Science develops specifically to counter these biases. Double-blind studies prevent expectations from influencing results. Peer review catches errors and flawed reasoning. Replication ensures findings aren't flukes. Statistical analysis distinguishes signal from noise. These tools aren't perfect, but they dramatically improve reliability compared to casual observation. Atlantis research rarely employs such methods. It relies heavily on interpretation of ancient texts, assessment of archaeological similarities, and intuitive judgments about what seems plausible. These approaches can generate interesting hypotheses, but can't rigorously test them. The result is endless debate without resolution. Both sides present evidence. Both claim the other ignores important data. Neither can definitively prove their case. The stalemate continues indefinitely. Breaking this impasse would require agreed-upon standards for evidence. What would prove Atlantis existed? What would prove it didn't? Without such criteria, the debate becomes untethered from reality. It floats in a realm of pure speculation where anything can be argued, but nothing can be settled. This might satisfy those who enjoy the mystery, but it frustrates anyone seeking actual answers. The tragedy is that genuine archaeological mysteries exist that deserve attention. Göbekli Tepe, as mentioned earlier, challenges our understanding of human development. The Antikythera mechanism demonstrates ancient technological sophistication. The Nazca lines pose questions about purpose and meaning. These verified discoveries are as fascinating as any Atlantis speculation. They offer real puzzles to solve using actual evidence, yet they receive less popular attention than Atlantis. Why? Perhaps because they're constrained by evidence. The mystery has limits. We know roughly when these things were created, where they came from, what materials were used. The questions are specific rather than open-ended. There's less room for imagination to run wild. The wonder is grounded in reality rather than floating impossibility. Atlantis offers unlimited imaginative space. It can be anything believers want it to be: ancient, advanced, destroyed, hidden. The lack of constraints is precisely the appeal. This freedom explains why Atlantis discussions often become more about philosophy than archaeology. People aren't really debating whether a specific civilization existed. They're debating what's possible, what we know, what we assume, and what counts as evidence. These are fundamentally epistemological questions dressed up as historical ones. The Atlantis debate becomes a proxy for larger disagreements about knowledge, authority, and how we determine truth. Some see mainstream archaeology as too conservative, too quick to dismiss unconventional ideas, too protective of established narratives. Others see alternative researchers as too credulous, too quick to connect dots that shouldn't be connected, too eager to overturn consensus without sufficient cause. Both perspectives contain truth. Academia can be resistant to paradigm shifts. Outsider researchers can lack necessary rigor. The challenge is distinguishing legitimate criticism from conspiracy thinking. Conspiracy theories thrive on this same ambiguity. They reframe lack of evidence as suppression. Skepticism becomes proof of cover-up. The absence of confirmation transforms into confirmation of absence being hidden. This logical structure is self-sealing. No evidence could ever disprove it, because any contradicting evidence would simply be added to the conspiracy. The theory becomes unfalsifiable, which means it's not actually a theory in the scientific sense. It's an article of faith. Not everyone who believes in Atlantis is a conspiracy theorist. Many simply find the idea compelling based on the evidence they've encountered. They're not claiming secret suppression or deliberate deception. They just think the conventional interpretation is wrong. This is a legitimate position if argued from evidence. The problem arises when evidence fails to convince and believers retreat into accusations of institutional bias. At that point, the discussion stops being about Atlantis and starts being about power, authority, and who gets to decide what's true. These meta-debates are often more interesting than the original question. They force us to examine our assumptions about knowledge. How do we know what we know? What makes an expert reliable? When should consensus be trusted versus questioned? These aren't easy questions. Reasonable people disagree. The answers depend partly on values, not just evidence. How much certainty do we need before accepting a claim? How much risk are we willing to tolerate that we're wrong? Different people have different thresholds. Some prefer to believe until proven wrong. Others prefer skepticism until proven right. Neither approach is inherently superior. They represent different attitudes toward uncertainty. The believe until disproven camp values openness and avoids prematurely closing off possibilities. The skeptic until proven camp values rigor and avoids accepting claims that might be false. Both have merit. Both have risks. Excessive openness leads to believing things that aren't true. Excessive skepticism leads to dismissing things that are. Finding the right balance is difficult. Science leans towards skepticism, but not absolute skepticism. Claims are evaluated based on plausibility, evidence quality, and consistency with established knowledge. Extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, not because of bias, but because unlikely things are by definition unlikely. If someone claims they saw a dog, we believe them. If they claim they saw a dinosaur, we need more evidence. This isn't prejudice, it's probability. Atlantis falls somewhere between dogs and dinosaurs on the plausibility spectrum. Advanced ancient civilizations aren't impossible. We know sophisticated societies existed, but global catastrophes erasing all trace. That's harder to swallow. Not impossible, but requiring substantial proof. The question becomes whether the available evidence reaches that threshold. Mainstream archaeology says no. Alternative researchers say yes. The disagreement isn't about evidence quality, but about interpretation and standards. This is where the debate gets philosophical. What constitutes sufficient evidence? How similar do things need to be before we infer connection? How much weight should we give to ancient texts versus physical artifacts? These questions don't have objective answers. They involve judgment calls where reasonable people differ. The problem is that both sides often present their judgment as the only reasonable conclusion. This transforms disagreement into accusations of irrationality. Yet neither side is irrational. They're working from different premises and priorities. Mainstream archaeologists prioritize consistency with established knowledge and physical evidence. Alternative researchers prioritize explanatory power and pattern recognition. These are both legitimate values. The tension arises because they sometimes point in different directions. A theory might elegantly explain multiple mysteries while lacking physical proof. Is elegance enough? Depends who you ask. Scientists generally say no. Elegance without evidence is just speculation. But some scientific theories were initially accepted partly on elegance before evidence caught up. Einstein's relativity was mathematically beautiful before it was experimentally confirmed. The Big Bang Theory explained multiple observations before direct evidence emerged. Sometimes theoretical elegance predicts reality. Other times it's just pretty mathematics with no physical referent. Distinguishing these cases requires waiting for evidence. That's unsatisfying for those who want answers now. But reality doesn't care about our impatience. The universe reveals itself on its own schedule. We can speculate, hypothesize, and theorize, but ultimately, nature decides what's true. Our job is to listen carefully to what it's telling us. This requires humility. We must accept that our intuitions might be wrong, our interpretations might be biased, our pattern recognition might be faulty. This humility is easier to preach than practice. Everyone thinks they're open-minded and everyone else is biased. Psychologists have studied this extensively. We're remarkably good at spotting others' biases while remaining blind to our own. We evaluate evidence supporting our beliefs less critically than evidence contradicting them. We remember hits and forget misses. We attribute success to skill and failure to bad luck. These patterns aren't character flaws. They're features of human cognition that helped our ancestors survive but now sometimes lead us astray. Recognizing these patterns in ourselves is difficult but necessary. It requires constantly questioning our assumptions and asking what evidence would change our minds. If the answer is nothing could change your mind, you're not doing reasoning. You're doing rationalization. True belief formation updates based on evidence. It's probabilistic rather than absolute. New information shifts confidence up or down. Nothing is completely certain except perhaps mathematical and logical truths. This probabilistic thinking feels uncomfortable. We want definite answers, binary yes or no. But most interesting questions don't work that way. Did Atlantis exist? The honest answer is probably not, but we can't be completely certain. How confident should we be? That depends on how we weigh the evidence. Reasonable people might land at different confidence levels while agreeing on the evidence itself. This is normal. Uncertainty is the natural state of knowledge, yet our culture treats uncertainty as weakness. Pundits speak with absolute confidence about uncertain topics. Politicians promise certainty where none exists. Advertisers claim definitive results from preliminary studies. This cultural pressure toward false certainty makes nuanced discussion difficult. Admitting uncertainty feels like conceding defeat, but it's actually intellectual honesty. The Atlantis debate would benefit from more uncertainty acknowledgement. Instead of definitive claims about what definitely happened, we need probabilistic statements about what seems likely. Mainstream archaeologists could say the evidence currently suggests Atlantis was fictional while remaining open to new discoveries. Alternative researchers could say the patterns are suggestive while acknowledging they're not conclusive. This wouldn't resolve the debate, but it would make it more productive. Productive disagreement requires good faith on both sides. Each must assume the other is honestly mistaken rather than dishonest or stupid. This is hard when emotions run high. People who've devoted years to Atlantis research feel attacked when told their work is worthless. Archaeologists who've spent careers building expertise feel disrespected when dismissed as closed-minded. Both reactions are understandable. Both make productive dialogue harder. The internet amplifies these dynamics. Social media rewards outrage and certainty. Nuance gets ignored. Extreme positions get amplified. People retreat into echo chambers where everyone agrees with them. This creates the illusion that only idiots believe differently. In reality, smart people disagree about complicated things all the time. Intelligence doesn't prevent disagreement. It sometimes intensifies it because intelligent people are better at rationalizing their positions. What helps is recognizing that disagreement often stems from different values rather than different facts. Two people can look at identical evidence and reach different conclusions based on what they prioritize. One might prioritize avoiding false negatives, accepting weaker evidence to avoid missing true discoveries. Another might prioritize avoiding false positives, demanding stronger evidence to prevent accepting false claims. Neither is wrong. They're optimizing for different error types. Science traditionally prioritizes avoiding false positives. Better to miss a true discovery than accept a false one. This conservative bias frustrates those who think we're missing important truths, but it's served science well overall. Most revolutionary claims turn out to be wrong. Being skeptical by default saves time and prevents wild goose chases. The cost is occasionally delayed recognition of genuine breakthroughs. Atlantis advocates often argue we're in one of those delayed recognition scenarios. They see themselves as ahead of their time, promoting truths that will eventually be vindicated. This narrative is compelling because it sometimes happens. Continental drift was initially dismissed. Meteorite impacts causing extinctions were ridiculed. Bacterial causes of ulcers were ignored. Scientific consensus has been wrong before. It will be wrong again. But for every vindicated maverick, there are thousands of wrong mavericks who stay wrong. Confirmation bias ensures we remember the former and forget the latter. This creates an illusion that maverick positions are more often correct than they actually are. In reality, consensus usually exists for good reasons. It's not infallible, but betting against it requires strong evidence. Extraordinary claims need extraordinary support. The phrase, extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence, is often misunderstood. It doesn't mean we're biased against certain ideas. It's a probabilistic statement. Unlikely claims need stronger evidence because they're unlikely. If I claim I own a car, you'll probably believe me with minimal evidence. If I claim I own a unicorn, you'll need much stronger proof. Same evidentiary standard, different priors. Atlantis is an extraordinary claim in this sense, not because it's impossible, but because it requires overturning substantial existing knowledge. We'd need to explain why no physical evidence exists despite extensive archaeological work. We'd need to account for why ancient texts outside Plato don't mention it. We'd need to identify the catastrophe that destroyed it. These aren't insurmountable challenges, but they're significant ones. Meeting them requires more than suggestive patterns. This is where most Atlantis evidence falls short. It's suggestive but not conclusive. Plato's detailed description suggests real knowledge, but could be creative fiction. Geological evidence shows ancient catastrophes, but not specifically the one Plato described. Cultural similarities across civilizations suggest contact, but could result from independent invention. None of this is worthless. It's just not sufficient to overcome the prior improbability. What would be sufficient? Probably physical evidence clearly linking disparate civilizations to a common source. Artifacts with unique characteristics appearing in multiple locations but nowhere in between. Genetic evidence showing population movements matching the Atlantis timeline. Written records from multiple independent sources describing the same civilization. Such evidence would be hard to dismiss. Its absence is telling. Alternative researchers sometimes argue that absence of evidence isn't evidence of absence. This is technically true, but misleading. When we've looked extensively in places where evidence should exist and found nothing, that absence is informative. It doesn't prove something didn't exist, but it lowers the probability. After a century of intensive archaeology finding nothing clearly Atlantean, we should reduce our confidence that it existed. This Bayesian updating is how rational belief should work. Start with a prior probability based on background knowledge. Update based on evidence. Repeat as new evidence emerges. Currently, the evidence doesn't support Atlantis' existence. That could change with new discoveries, but betting on such discoveries requires faith in future findings rather than acceptance of present evidence. That's fine as personal speculation, but shouldn't be presented as established fact. The distinction between speculation and fact matters. Speculation is valuable. It generates hypotheses and drives exploration. But it's not knowledge. Knowledge requires evidence and justification. Speculation that doesn't pan out isn't wrong to have pursued. It's just not confirmed. The mistake is treating unconfirmed speculation as established truth. This happens constantly in fringe archaeology. Hypotheses become assertions. Possibilities become certainties. Questions become answers. Maintaining this distinction requires discipline. We must resist the psychological satisfaction of certainty when uncertainty is appropriate. We must accept that some questions remain unanswered indefinitely. We must tolerate the discomfort of not knowing. These are difficult, but necessary intellectual virtues. They're what separate genuine inquiry from wishful thinking. The Atlantis story ultimately matters less for what it reveals about the past than for what it reveals about ourselves. Our relationship with this myth says something profound about human psychology, about how we construct meaning, and about the stories we tell when confronted with the vastness of history. Consider what Atlantis represents in the popular imagination. It's not just a lost civilization, it's a perfect civilization, destroyed at its height. This narrative structure appears across cultures: Eden before the fall, the Golden Age before corruption, Camelot before betrayal. These stories share a common pattern. Perfection existed once, then was lost. We live in the diminished aftermath. This narrative is psychologically powerful because it validates a universal human feeling that something is wrong with the present. We sense that life should be better, easier, more meaningful. The myth of a lost golden age externalizes this feeling. It's not that we're flawed or that existence is difficult. It's that we fell from grace. Somewhere in the past, things were right. This provides both explanation and hope. If perfection existed once, perhaps it can be recovered. Atlantis functions as this lost perfection, a civilization that mastered technology, achieved harmony, and understood cosmic truths we've forgotten. Its destruction wasn't entropy or internal failure. It was catastrophe, sudden and external. This preserves the myth's purity. Atlantis didn't decline. It was cut off in its prime, leaving us to wonder what might have been. But the psychological appeal is obvious. But it comes with costs. When we project perfection onto the past, we distort our understanding of both past and present. Ancient civilizations were remarkable, but they weren't perfect. They struggled with the same problems we do. Resource scarcity, social conflict, environmental challenges, mortality. Projecting our fantasies backward obscures these realities. It also diminishes actual ancient achievements. Real civilizations adapted to difficult environments, developed sophisticated technologies with limited resources, and created lasting cultural innovations. These accomplishments are more impressive than mythical super-civilizations because they're real. They were achieved by people like us, working with what they had. When we fantasize about Atlan, teen crystal technology, we devalue the ingenuity of pyramid builders who achieved the impossible with rope, copper, and human efforts. But there's something else happening too. The Atlantis narrative often carries implicit criticism of modernity. If ancient wisdom was superior to modern knowledge, then progress is illusory. If catastrophe destroyed advanced civilizations before, perhaps we're headed for the same fate. This apocalyptic undertone appears frequently in alternative archaeology. Modern civilization is corrupt, disconnected, materialistic. Ancient civilizations were spiritual, harmonious, enlightened. We've traded wisdom for technology, meaning for comfort. The coming catastrophe will destroy our arrogance as it destroyed Atlantis. This narrative feels profound, but it's historically shallow. Every era considers itself uniquely terrible and imagines the past was better. Medieval monks lamented declining piety compa, read to early Christians. Victorian intellectuals worried about moral decay compared to classical antiquity. Every generation discovers that the world is ending. Yet here we are. This doesn't mean everything is fine. We face genuine problems, some unprecedented in scale. Climate change, nuclear weapons, and artificial intelligence pose real existential risks. But these risks aren't validation of ancient prophecies. They're consequences of specific technological and social developments. Addressing them requires understanding their actual causes, not seeking wisdom in mythical lost civilizations. The Atlantis story also reveals how we think about knowledge and authority. Mainstream archaeology operates within institutional frameworks: universities, peer review, academic journals. This system has flaws. It can be conservative, slow to accept new ideas, and sometimes gatekeeping. But it exists for reasons. Peer review catches errors. Institutional memory prevents rediscovering old mistakes. Professional training provides context and methodology. These aren't perfect, but they're better than nothing. Alternative archaeology often presents itself as rebellion against this system. Maverick researchers challenging dogmatic academics. Truth seekers facing institutional suppression. This narrative is appealing because institutions do sometimes resist valid challenges. Science advances through paradigm shifts. Establishment rejection doesn't automatically invalidate ideas, but it doesn't validate them either. Most rejected ideas are rejected because they're wrong. The ratio of legitimate paradigm shifts to crackpot theories is extremely low. Bet on the establishment being wrong occasionally. Bet on the maverick being wrong usually. This doesn't mean dismiss alternatives automatically. It means require them to meet the same evidentiary standards. If someone claims academics are wrong about Atlantis, they need to provide better evidence than academics have. Anecdotes, suggestive patterns, and creative interpretations aren't sufficient. You need physical artifacts, genetic data, or textual records that academics can't explain away. Without this, you're asking people to believe something based on less evidence than the mainstream position. That's not healthy skepticism. That's credulity. The internet has complicated this dynamic enormously. Information that once required library access or academic credentials now spreads instantly. This democratization has benefits. Genuine discoveries can come from unexpected sources. Collaboration happens across traditional boundaries. Enthusiasts contribute meaningfully to research, but it also means misinformation spreads as quickly as information. Compelling narratives outcompete careful analysis. Confirmation bias finds endless reinforcement. Echo chambers form around almost any idea. Atlantis thrives in this environment. YouTube documentaries with millions of views present fringe theories as suppressed truth. Social media threads connect disparate anomalies into grand narratives. Algorithms reward engagement over accuracy. So sensate, iron ore claims spread while nuanced rebuttals languish. This creates genuine confusion about what's credible. If a documentary looks professional and a professor seems dismissive, how do non-experts judge? This is where scientific literacy matters. Not memorizing facts, but understanding how knowledge is produced. What counts as evidence? How do we test claims? What makes explanations better or worse? These methodological questions matter more than specific facts. Learn the process, and you can evaluate claims yourself. Without it, you're at the mercy of whoever sounds most confident. Atlantis functions as a test case. It's famous enough that everyone's heard of it, simple enough to understand, and ambiguous enough to remain debatable. How you think about Atlantis reveals how you think about knowledge generally. If you're drawn to the idea despite lack of evidence, ask why. Is it the narrative appeal, the anti-establishment framing, the sense that mainstream sources miss important truths? These aren't necessarily wrong reasons, but they're not evidence. Separate what you want to be true from what you have reason to believe is true. If you're skeptical of Atlantis, examine that too. Is it based on evidence or just trust in authority? Have you actually looked at the arguments or dismissed them reflexively? Skepticism should be active, not passive. Don't believe things without evidence, but don't disbelieve without consideration either. The goal isn't taking sides, it's thinking clearly. Atlantis doesn't matter much in itself. Whether it existed affects nothing about how we live, but how we think about it matters. It's practice for harder questions. How do we evaluate scientific claims about climate, health, or technology? How do we navigate information environments designed to manipulate? How do we distinguish truth from compelling fiction? These skills determine whether we're equipped for the modern world. The persistence of the Atlantis myth also tells us something about what's missing from mainstream narratives. People turn to alternative theories when conventional accounts feel incomplete. If academic archaeology seemed more accessible, acknowledged its uncertainties more openly, and engaged with public questions more directly, perhaps fringe theories would gain less traction. This isn't about dumbing down or compromising rigor. It's about recognizing that knowledge exists in social context. When institutions seem distant, defensive, or dismissive, people seek alternatives. This creates opportunity for misinformation, but also responsibility for experts. If you want people to trust mainstream science, make it trustworthy. Acknowledge limitations. Admit uncertainties. Explain reasoning, not just conclusions. Treat questions respectfully, even when answers seem obvious to you. This doesn't mean entertaining obviously false claims endlessly. It means recognizing that public engagement is part of the scientific enterprise. Knowledge that stays locked in academic journals doesn't benefit anyone. Knowledge that reaches people in digestible form while maintaining accuracy serves everyone. Atlantis represents failure of this kind. Academic consensus says it didn't exist. But that consensus hasn't effectively communicated why to general audiences. So alternative narratives fill the void, offering certainty where mainstream sources offer complexity. This isn't entirely academics' fault. Media prefers simple stories. Audiences reward confidence over nuance. Algorithms boost engagement over accuracy. But it's also a genuine communication failure. Doing better requires effort from all sides. For those genuinely interested in ancient mysteries, better approaches exist. Study actual archaeology. Read academic sources, not just popular accounts. Learn what we actually know about ancient civilizations and how we know it. Visit museums. Examine artifacts. Understand methods. This isn't about accepting authority blindly. It's about building informed judgment. Once you understand mainstream positions properly, you can evaluate alternatives fairly. Maybe you'll find mainstream accounts convincing. Maybe you'll identify genuine gaps. Either way, you'll think more clearly than if you only encounter information through sensational documentaries. If you're drawn to alternative theories, test them seriously. Don't just accumulate suggestive evidence. Look for disconfirming evidence too. Which would prove the theory wrong? If nothing could, it's not scientific. If something could but you haven't looked, you're not being intellectually honest. Apply the same scrutiny to alternatives that you apply to mainstream positions. If you demand rigorous proof from academics but accept speculation from mavericks, examine that double standard. Truth doesn't care about narrative appeal. It doesn't reward underdogs or punish establishments. It simply is. Finding it requires following evidence wherever it leads, even when destinations disappoint. Sometimes mysteries remain mysteries. Sometimes romantic ideas prove false. Sometimes the truth is less interesting than the fiction. Intellectual maturity means accepting this without resentment. The Atlantis story will continue regardless of evidence. It's too embedded in culture, too useful as metaphor, too appealing as narrative. That's fine. Myths serve purposes beyond literal truth. They express values, encode wisdom, and provide shared reference points. Atlantis as myth harms nothing. Atlantis as suppressed history harms understanding. The distinction matters. Enjoy the story. But know it's a story. Appreciate what it represents. But don't mistake representation for reality. Use it as inspiration for genuine curiosity about the past. Let it drive you toward actual archaeology, real history, and honest inquiry. Just don't let it replace them. The actual human past is extraordinary enough without embellishment. Civilizations rose in impossible places. Technologies emerged from unlikely circumstances. Cultures achieved remarkable things with limited resources. These stories don't require Atlantean intervention. They're impressive precisely because real people accomplished them. When we credit ancient achievements to mythical super-civilizations, we diminish human capability. We suggest that our ancestors needed outside help to achieve what they achieved. This is both historically wrong and philosophically insulting. It assumes that people like us couldn't have built pyramids, navigated oceans, or developed writing. But they could and did. Recognizing this doesn't diminish mystery. It deepens respect. What remains after we set aside the myth is still remarkable. Plato wrote a story so compelling it survived millennia. Human civilizations developed independently across continents. Ancient peoples achieved technological marvels we struggle to explain. These realities are more wonderful than any fiction because they're true. They're the foundation we build on, not fantasies we hide behind. The search for Atlantis reveals what we value: mystery, meaning, connection to the past. These are worthy values, but they're better served by honest engagement with history than by chasing myths. The past offers enough genuine mystery without manufacturing more. Enough actual achievement without inventing predecessors. Enough real human drama without fictional catastrophes. Everything we seek in Atlantis already exists in the archaeological record, waiting for those willing to look carefully. That's where the real story lives. Not in Plato's imagination or modern speculation, but in the patient accumulation of evidence about who we were and how we got here. That story is still being written. Every excavation adds detail. Every analysis refines understanding. Every discovery adjusts the picture. This ongoing process is what Atlantis believers often claim to want: revelation of hidden history, recovery of lost knowledge, connection to ancient wisdom. But they seek it in the wrong place. It's not hidden in myths. It's buried in dirt, waiting for careful hands to uncover it. That's where truth lives. So here we are, thousands of words later, countless theories examined, evidence weighed, arguments dissected, and the question remains exactly where it started. Did Atlantis exist? The honest answer hasn't changed. Probably not. Almost certainly not. But the impossibility of absolute certainty leaves just enough room for the question to survive another generation. And maybe that's exactly as it should be, because the search was never really about finding ruins on a seafloor. It was about confronting what those ruins would mean. That human achievement is fragile. That knowledge can be lost. That civilizations, no matter how advanced, remain vulnerable to forces beyond their control. These truths don't require Atlantis to be real. They're demonstrated by every civilization that's actually fallen. Rome didn't sink beneath waves, but it fell just as completely. The Library of Alexandria didn't vanish in divine punishment, but it burned just as thoroughly. The Bronze Age collapse didn't happen in a day and night, but it was just as catastrophic. Real history provides everything the Atlantis myth promises. Except one thing: the comfort of blaming catastrophe on external forces rather than internal failure. Plato's Atlantis fell because the gods destroyed it. Convenient, clean. Not because of resource depletion, political instability, or social collapse. Not because the civilization contained the seeds of its own destruction. Just divine punishment for hubris. This narrative removes responsibility. If catastrophe comes from outside, we can't prevent it. We can only accept it. Real collapses tell different stories. They happen slowly, then suddenly. They result from choices compounding over time. They're preventable right until they're not. This is less comforting, but more useful. If civilizations fall due to internal dynamics, we can study those dynamics. Identify warning signs. Make different choices. Learn from patterns. The Atlantis myth teaches the opposite lesson, that catastrophe is external, sudden, and unavoidable. That great civilizations are destroyed, not by their own failures, but by forces beyond control. This removes agency. It suggests that what we do doesn't matter because fate will intervene regardless. It's fatalism dressed as wisdom. The alternative is harder but more honest. Civilizations end because of accumulating failures. Environmental degradation, resource depletion, inequality, political dysfunction. These develop over decades or centuries. They're visible to those willing to look. They're addressable by those willing to act. This places responsibility squarely on our shoulders. What happens next depends on choices we make now. That's terrifying. It's also empowering. If our fate isn't predetermined by ancient cycles or divine punishment, then we have agency. Imperfect, limited, uncertain agency. But agency nonetheless. The question isn't whether we'll fall like Atlantis. It's whether we'll fall like civilizations that actually existed, for reasons we can understand and potentially avoid. This requires abandoning comforting myths, accepting that there's no ancient wisdom to recover because ancient peoples face different problems with different tools. Acknowledging that we're not uniquely terrible because every era struggles with its own challenges. Recognizing that progress isn't illusion even though it doesn't solve everything. Most importantly, it requires accepting uncertainty without retreating into fantasy. We don't know everything about the past. We never will. Some questions remain permanently unanswerable. That's uncomfortable. But discomfort doesn't justify inventing answers. Better to live with honest uncertainty than false certainty. The search for Atlantis has consumed enormous resources: money, time, expertise. Was it wasted? Not entirely. It drove technological development. It inspired careers. It taught lessons about evidence, methodology, and human psychology. These aren't worthless outcomes even if the primary goal remained unachieved. But there's opportunity cost. Every expedition searching for Atlantis could have explored actual ancient sites. Every documentary about lost civilizations could have covered real archaeological discoveries. Every book speculating about Atlantean technology could have explained genuine ancient innovations. The attention and resources directed toward myths could have advanced actual understanding. This matters because the past deserves better. Real ancient peoples achieved extraordinary things. They developed agriculture independently on multiple continents. They built monuments that still inspire awe. They created art, music, literature, and philosophy that shaped human culture. They navigated by stars, engineered water systems, and organized complex societies, all without intervention from mythical precursors. When we credit Atlantis for these achievements, we rob actual ancient peoples of recognition. We suggest they needed outside help to accomplish what they accomplished. This is historically false and philosophically insulting. It assumes that people like us, with similar cognitive capabilities, couldn't have achieved what we know they achieved. It's a form of temporal condescension dressed as respect for the ancients. The truth is more impressive. Ancient peoples had the same intellectual capacity we do. They lacked accumulated knowledge and developed technology, but not intelligence or creativity. Given time and resources, they figured things out. They experimented, failed, learned, and tried again. They passed knowledge across generations. They built on what came before. This is how progress actually works. Slowly, incrementally, through countless small innovations rather than sudden revelations. There's no shortcut. No lost wisdom that would solve our problems if only we could recover it. The challenges we face are new, requiring new solutions. Climate change didn't threaten ancient civilizations. Nuclear weapons didn't exist. Artificial intelligence wasn't a concern. We can't look backward for answers to forward-facing problems, but we can learn from patterns. How did previous civilizations handle resource scarcity? What happened when inequality grew too extreme? Which societies adapted successfully to environmental change? These questions have historical answers. Not perfect templates, but useful precedents. This is what studying the actual past provides. Not mythical wisdom, but applicable lessons. Atlantis offers none of this. None of